There are few forces in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium more terrible than truth itself. For 10,000 years, the galaxy has endured upon foundations built not of adamantium or ceramite, but of carefully crafted lies. Each faction, each empire, each species has survived by burying their deepest shames beneath layers of propaganda, myth, and willful ignorance. Yet even the most closely guarded secrets cannot remain hidden when the very fabric of reality tears itself asunder. The great rift blazed across the heavens like a wound in the soul of creation itself. Where once the galaxy knew only the cold light of distant stars, now the raw fury of the imperium spilled forth in torrents of madness and flame. Upon Terra, the Emperor's psychic screams echoed through the throne room as the Golden Throne's mechanisms strained against powers beyond mortal comprehension. The very walls of reality grew thin, and through those cracks, something unprecedented began to bleed through. It began as whispers in the minds of astropaths. Across 10,000 worlds, the Emperor's chosen servants felt their thoughts invaded by visions not of the present or future, but of truths deliberately hidden. On Macraga, Chief Librarian Tigurius doubled over in his meditation chamber as forbidden knowledge flooded his consciousness. Images of lost brothers, of legions that had been scrubbed from history itself, blazed through his mind with the intensity of dying suns. He saw the 2nd and the 11th, their names carved from the very stones of memory, their gene sons scattered to the winds or quietly absorbed into the ranks of the 13th and 7th legions. The phenomenon spread with terrifying swiftness. On Mars, tech adepts screamed in binary as the machine god's greatest lies unraveled in their minds. The Omnissiah was not the avatar of their deity, but a man who had sought godhood through the worship of billions. Their prayers, their devotion, their very existence had been built upon a foundation of calculated deception. Forge worlds across the galaxy reported similar breakdowns as the cult Mechanicus faced the shattering of its core mythology. Yet the revelations were not confined to the Imperium alone. In the webway city of Comera, Archons paused mid-torture as their minds were suddenly flooded with knowledge of their own desperate vulnerability. They saw themselves as they truly were not proud predators ruling from shadows, but terrified refugees clinging to existence through increasingly desperate acts of cruelty. Their souls leaked like water through cupped hands, and every scream they harvested was a moment's reprieve from the hunger of she who thirsts. The Tau Empire shuddered as fire-cast warriors across 100 sept worlds suddenly understood the chemical chains that bound their minds. Commander Puretide's teachings had been built upon a lie so fundamental that its exposure threatened to tear the very fabric of Tau society apart. The greater good was not a philosophy willingly embraced, but a form of slavery so subtle that even the enslaved believed themselves free. In the depths of space, Commander Farsight felt grim satisfaction as truths he had suspected for decades were finally laid bare for all to see. Across the galaxy, the phenomenon struck with the force of a psychic tsunami. On distant Baal, blood angels fell to their knees as they witnessed visions of their gene father's final moments, seeing truths about the red thirst and black rage that had been hidden even from their chapter master. The space wolves howled in anguish as the shame of Prospero burned fresh in their minds, no longer softened by 10 millennia of justification and selective memory. In the Eye of Terror, even the Chaos Space Marines were not spared. Traitor legions that had embraced damnation found themselves confronting the pathetic reality of their rebellion. They had not chosen freedom, but had merely traded one form of slavery for another. The dark gods they served were not liberators, but parasites, feeding on the very emotions that had driven them to betrayal. The laughter of Tzeentch rang hollow as his greatest lie unraveled before eyes that had forgotten how to see truth. The Necron dynasties stirred in their tomb worlds as knowledge, long suppressed by the Silent King's authority, blazed through their quantum consciousness. They learned of Zarek's true agenda, of his plan to steal the flesh of the living and condemn his own people to eternal servitude so that he might reclaim mortality. The ancient nobles who had followed him into biotransference discovered that their sacrifice had been for nothing more than their overlord's private horror at what he had become. Far from the galaxy's edge, Hive Fleet Leviathan paused in its relentless advance as the hive mind itself was touched by visions that transcended its usual hunger. For the first time in eons beyond counting, the great devourer saw itself as others saw it, not as evolution's perfect expression, but as a cosmic plague that had already consumed galaxies beyond number. The scope of its own destruction became clear, and with that clarity came something the Tyranids had never before experienced: doubt. On Terra, the High Lords of Terra scrambled to understand reports flooding in from across the Imperium. Entire PDF regiments had laid down their arms after learning that their beloved Emperor had deliberately fostered the very superstitions he had once sought to destroy. Planetary governors found themselves facing rebellions not born of heresy or ambition, but of simple, devastating truth. The Imperial Creed, the foundation upon which 10,000 years of human suffering had been justified, stood revealed as the final manipulation of a being who had sought apotheosis through the worship of his own children. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all were the reports from the Inquisition itself. Inquisitor lords who had spent lifetimes hunting heretics and purging the unfaithful now saw their own organization's darkest truths laid bare. They witnessed the Harutian and Xanthite cabals, the radical factions that sought to harness chaos itself. They saw the Thorian attempts to resurrect the Emperor. They understood at last that the organization dedicated to preserving humanity's purity had become the very thing it claimed to fight against. The galaxy reeled as if struck by an invisible blow. On 1,000,000 worlds, populations that had lived in ignorance for millennia suddenly found themselves confronting truths too vast and terrible for mortal minds to fully comprehend. Some wept, others raged, many simply stood in stunned silence as the foundations of their reality crumbled like sandcastles before a rising tide. And through it all, the great rift continued to expand, its psychic winds carrying whispers of even greater revelations yet to come. The secrets of the Eldar, the truth behind the Orc Gestalt consciousness, the hidden shames of the Dark Angels, all these and more, waited in the wings, like actors preparing for their moment upon a stage built of lies and maintained through violence. The galaxy had survived the Horus heresy, the age of apostasy, and countless Orc invasions. It had endured the arrival of the Tyranids and weathered the birth of the Great Rift itself. But now it faced something far more destructive than any external threat: the truth about itself. And in that moment, as billions of minds reeled under the weight of unwanted knowledge, the first cracks began to appear in the edifice of order that had held the galaxy together for 10 millennia. The war that followed would make the Horus heresy look like a minor dispute between brothers. For when the foundation of everything you believe proves to be built upon lies, what choice remains but to tear it all down and begin again? The Imperial Palace had endured 10,000 years of warfare, siege, and the slow decay of time itself. Its walls had withstood the fury of Horus, and the endless assaults of chaos, yet now they trembled before something far more destructive than any weapon forged by mortal hands. Truth, naked and unforgiving, blazed through the corridors of power like wildfire through parchment. High Lord Militant Constantine Valdor had witnessed the birth of the Imperium, had stood beside the Emperor as he forged humanity's destiny among the stars. Yet even his ancient mind reeled as the full scope of the master of mankind's deception unfolded before him. The imperial truth, that fundamental rejection of superstition and religious thought, had been nothing more than a calculated lie. Every word the Emperor had spoken about reason, science, and the futility of faith had been uttered by a being who sought to become a god through the worship of his own children. Across Terra, the revelation spread like a plague of enlightenment. In the Administratum, scribes who had spent lifetimes cataloguing the Emperor's edicts found themselves staring at documents that now read like the blueprints of a cosmic deception. The Imperial Creed, which had sustained humanity through its darkest hours, stood revealed as the final manipulation of a being who had orchestrated his own apotheosis. Every prayer, every hymn, every act of devotion had been fuel for a transformation that spanned millennia. The masses gathered in St. Euphrates Square wept openly as Cardinal Macarius struggled to find words that could reconcile their faith with the terrible knowledge that blazed in their minds. The God-Emperor they worshipped had indeed become divine, but through methods that made mockery of every sacrifice they had offered in his name. Their devotion had been real, but it had been harvested like grain, gathered and refined to feed an ambition that transcended mortal comprehension. Yet even this revelation paled before the knowledge that now burned in the minds of the Space Marines. In fortress monasteries across the galaxy, chapter masters gathered their battle brothers to confront truths that struck at the very core of their existence. The Primarchs had not been 20 in number, but 22. The 2nd and the 11th had walked among their brothers, had led legions in the Great Crusade, had been loved and revered by their gene sons, just as Guilliman and Dawn were loved by theirs. Brother Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines knelt before the statue of his Primarch and felt tears he had thought impossible streaming down his scarred cheeks. The Codex Astartes, that sacred text which had shaped his entire existence, had been written to cover the erasure of 2 entire bloodlines. The 13th Legion's numbers had swelled not through recruitment alone, but through the absorption of survivors from legions whose very names had been carved from history. On Mars, the revelation struck with the force of a plasma bomb. Tech Adept Coriel Zeth, her augmetic implants sparking with feedback from the psychic storm, watched as her fellow servants of the Omnissiah tore at their robes in anguish. The machine god they served was no deity at all, but a man who had deliberately fostered their worship to strengthen his own ascension to godhood. Every prayer in binary, every ritual of maintenance, every offering of sacred oils had been part of a web of manipulation that spanned the breadth of human space. Forge Master Lucas Chrome, his voice box crackling with static, attempted to address the growing crowds of tech priests gathered in the Fabricator General's antechamber. The Omnissiah was real, he insisted, his divine nature undeniable. Yet even as he spoke, his words rang hollow in the face of knowledge that could not be denied or suppressed. The Emperor's machine spirit signatures, his understanding of ancient technology, his communion with machine spirits, all of it had been the calculated performance of a being who understood that worship was power made manifest. The ripples of revelation spread beyond Terra like shock waves from a dying star. On Macragge, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar faced a gathering of his captains with the weight of centuries pressing down upon his shoulders. The Ultramarines had always prided themselves on their adherence to the Codex, their unwavering loyalty to the memory of Robert Guilliman. Yet now they learned that their sacred numbers had been built upon the bones of brothers whose names they would never know, whose gene legacies had been absorbed into their own without acknowledgement or remembrance. Sergeant Tellian, his weathered features etched with lines of grief, spoke what others dared not voice aloud. 2 Primarchs had been systematically erased, their legions scattered or destroyed, their very existence deemed too dangerous to remember. The Space Marines had fought for 10,000 years, believing themselves the heirs of 20 demigod fathers, never knowing that 2 of their bloodlines had been deemed unworthy of existence itself. On distant Fenris, the Space Wolves howled their anguish to the frozen skies. Logan Grimnar, the great wolf himself, stood among the tombstones of heroes and felt the weight of a truth too terrible to bear. The Emperor had not merely allowed the erasure of 2 legions, he had ordered it. The Master of Mankind, who had created them as his sons, had condemned 2 of those sons to a fate worse than death. Complete oblivion. The Inquisition, that most secret and terrible of the Imperium's institutions, found itself paralyzed by the very knowledge it existed to suppress. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Koteas, his psychic wards blazing with desperate energy, watched as his own organization began to tear itself apart. How could they purge knowledge that already existed in every mind? How could they maintain the lies that had sustained the Imperium when those lies had been exposed to every living soul? Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, his Terminator armor scarred by 1,000 battles against the forces of chaos, stood in the Chamber of Vigilance and witnessed the collapse of everything he had fought to protect. The Harusian cabals, the Xanthite conspiracies, the radical factions that sought to harness the power of chaos, all stood revealed as symptoms of a deeper corruption that had infected the very heart of the Inquisition. They had become the very heretics they sought to destroy, and their corruption had been sanctioned by an organization that claimed to serve the purest expression of humanity's will. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Custodes maintained their eternal vigil over the Golden Throne. Yet even these genetically perfected guardians felt the weight of terrible knowledge pressing against their minds. The Emperor they protected was indeed dying, not from the wounds inflicted by Horus, but from the very device that sustained his existence. The Golden Throne was not preserving their master, it was killing him slowly, over and over again, in an endless cycle of death and rebirth that had continued for 10 millennia. Captain General Trajan Valoris, his auramite armor gleaming in the throne room's eternal twilight, gazed upon the withered form of his master and understood at last the true cost of the Emperor's ascension. Every day, the master of mankind died. Every day, he was reborn through mechanisms that would have been considered an abomination by the very imperial truth he had once preached. The Carrion Lord sat upon a throne of torment, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily, dying and living in eternal agony, so that his psychic might could hold back the darkness of the warp. The revelation struck at the very foundations of imperial society, like acid eating through steel. Planetary defense forces laid down their weapons as the truth of their service was revealed to them. They had not been defending humanity from the darkness, but feeding a machine of worship that had transformed their beloved emperor into something that transcended mortality through methods that mocked every principle he had once espoused. Governor Militant Lugo of Cardia felt his world tilting beneath his feet as the implications became clear. The eye of terror that wound in reality from which chaos spilled forth in endless waves, had been held at bay not by human courage and imperial might, but by the psychic screams of a being who had deliberately orchestrated his own transformation into the very thing he had once claimed to oppose. The defenders of Cardia had died believing they served reason and order, never knowing they bled for a god who had achieved divinity through deception. Across the galaxy, the faithful gathered in cathedrals and shrine worlds to pray for guidance that would never come. The Emperor could not answer their prayers, not because he was distant or silent, but because he was trapped in an eternal moment of dying, his consciousness fragmented across the warp like shattered glass, each piece screaming in agony as it was reforged moment by moment into something that bore only passing resemblance to the man he had once been. The imperial truth lay in ruins, and from its ashes rose something far more terrible than any heresy. The understanding that faith and reason, devotion and manipulation, godhood and damnation were separated by lines so thin as to be meaningless. The Emperor had become everything he had warned against, and his children had been the unwitting architects of a transformation that had consumed the very soul of humanity's greatest champion. The galaxy burned with the light of unwanted knowledge, and in that blazing illumination, the first cracks in the Imperium's foundation widened into chasms that would swallow worlds whole. Of all the Space Marine chapters that knelt in service to the Golden Throne, none had guarded their secrets more jealously than the Dark Angels. For 10,000 years, the sons of Lion L. Johnson had walked among their brother chapters as paragons of honor and discipline, their green armor polished to perfection, their devotion to the Emperor beyond question. Yet beneath that veneer of righteousness lay a shame so profound that they had murdered their own allies to keep it hidden. Supreme Grand Master Azrael stood in the chamber of contemplation aboard the rock, his weathered features carved from stone as the weight of inevitable judgment pressed down upon him. The psychic storm that had torn through the galaxy had stripped away the veils that had protected his chapter's darkest secret. Across the Imperium, from the lowliest hive dweller to the mightiest chapter master, every soul now knew the truth that the inner circle had died to protect. Luther had fallen. The Dark Angels had torn themselves apart in civil war while the galaxy burned around them. Half the First Legion had turned traitor, not to Horus, not to the Chaos gods, but to their own Primarch, and in their hubris and jealousy, they had damned themselves to an existence of eternal hunt and hidden shame. The knowledge blazed in the minds of billions like a brand burned into flesh. On Terra, the High Lords read reports that detailed 10 millennia of betrayal, of imperial forces abandoned mid-battle as the Dark Angels pursued their private war against the fallen. Entire campaigns had been compromised, whole worlds lost to Xenos or heretic, because the First Legion's attention had been divided between duty to the Imperium and their obsession with capturing their traitorous brothers. Brother Captain Belial of the Deathwing knelt before the shrine of the Lion and felt the weight of every life lost to their secrecy. The Battle of Ramiel, where they had withdrawn their forces at the crucial moment to pursue a rumor of fallen presence. The Siege of Mordian's Gate, where their sudden departure had left Imperial Guard regiments exposed to Orc assault. The defense of Cadia itself, where Dark Angels had abandoned their positions to hunt whispers in the void. Each betrayal had been justified by the inner circle as necessary for the greater good of the chapter. But now those justifications crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. They had not been protecting the Imperium's honor, they had been protecting their own pride. Every abandoned ally, every broken oath, Every lie told to fellow Space Marines had been in service of a shame too great to acknowledge. On Macraga, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar convened an emergency council of the Ultramarines' senior command. The reports flooding in from across Ultramar spoke of Dark Angels forces that had vanished without explanation during crucial battles, of strike forces that had ignored direct orders to pursue mysterious objectives, of entire companies that had been redeployed mid-campaign for reasons that had never been adequately explained. Captain Sicarius, his scarred features etched with barely controlled fury, spoke what others barely dared to think. How many imperial victories had been stolen by the Dark Angels' pursuit of their private war? How many brothers had died because the First Legion placed their shame above their duty? The Codex Astartes, that sacred text which bound all loyal chapters in common purpose, had been violated 10,000 times over by warriors who claimed to be its most faithful adherents. The Imperial Fists, those stalwart defenders of Terra who had stood with Rogel Dawn through the darkest hours of the siege, felt their fury rise like a tide of molten gold. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh, his Terminator armor, bearing the scars of a century's warfare, reviewed tactical data that now made terrible sense. The Dark Angels' refusal to coordinate fleet movements, their reluctance to share intelligence, their habit of arriving at battlefields only to depart without explanation. Brother Sergeant Lysander, his storm shield still bearing the dents from his imprisonment in the Iron Warrior's fortress, clenched his fists until his gauntlets creaked under the strain. The Dark Angels had not been mysterious, they had been treacherous. Every time they had claimed operational security, every time they had invoked ancient privileges, every time they had withdrawn from battle, they had been choosing their private vendetta over the lives of their brother, Space Marines. On distant Fenris, the Space Wolves howled their outrage to the frozen skies. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf himself, paced the halls of the Fang like a caged beast as the full scope of the Dark Angels' betrayal became clear. The months of shame, the conflict between the Wolves and the Inquisition over the fate of Armageddon's survivors, suddenly took on new meaning. The Dark Angels had sided with the Inquisition not out of duty, but because they understood the value of keeping secrets, no matter the cost. Wolf-Lord Bjorn the Fell-Handed, ancient beyond measure and wise beyond counting, spoke in a voice like grinding stone of the patterns that now emerged from the mists of history. The Dark Angels had never stood with their brothers when doing so might expose their shame. They had chosen isolation over unity, secrecy over honor, and in doing so they had violated the very oaths that bound the Space Marines together as the Emperor's chosen warriors. Yet perhaps most damning of all was the revelation of what lay hidden in the depths of the rock itself. The asteroid fortress that had served as the Dark Angels' mobile headquarters for 10 millennia was revealed to contain not just armories and training chambers, but prisons. Deep in its core, beyond the reach of astropathic communication, lay cells where captured fallen angels had been tortured for information, their screams echoing through chambers that had never known the Emperor's light. Interrogator Chaplain Asmodai, his skull helmet gleaming in the dim light of the rock's forbidden levels, faced the judgment of brothers who now saw him for what he truly was. Not a servant of the Emperor's will, but a torturer who had spent centuries inflicting suffering on warriors who had once been his battle brothers. The litanies of hate he had recited, the prayers of redemption he had offered, all of it had been in service of a lie that poisoned the very foundations of the chapter's honor. The Watchers in the dark, those diminutive figures that had haunted the rock's corridors since the days of Caliban, stood revealed as something far more sinister than mere advisors. They were the keepers of shame, the guardians of secrets so terrible that even the dark angels themselves did not fully comprehend their significance. Their whispered counsel had guided the chapter not toward redemption, but deeper into damnation, each decision made in service of their cryptic agenda, drawing the sons of the Lion further from the light of the Emperor's truth. Brother Librarian Ezekiel, his psychic hood crackling with barely contained energy, struggled to maintain his sanity as the full weight of the chapter's crimes pressed against his mind. They had not been hunting the fallen to serve justice, they had been hunting them to preserve a lie. Every capture, every interrogation, every execution had been performed not to cleanse the galaxy of traitors, but to protect the Dark Angel's reputation among their brother chapters. Across the galaxy, other Space Marine chapters began to question their own histories with new eyes. If the Dark Angels, those paragons of honor and discipline, could harbor such treachery for 10 millennia, what other secrets might be hidden in the archives of the Adeptus Astartes? The Space Wolves examined their conflicts with the Inquisition. The Blood Angels questioned their concealment of the Black Rage. The Imperial Fists reviewed their recruitment practices from the criminal underworld of terror. The unity that had bound the Space Marines together as the Emperor's finest warriors began to crack like glass under pressure. Chapter masters who had once fought side by side now regarded each other with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The Feast of Malediction, where representatives of multiple chapters gathered to share intelligence and coordinate campaigns, became a forum for accusations and demands for accountability. Grandmaster Samael of the Raven Wing, his jet bike's engines screaming in harmony with his torment, led his warriors on one final hunt through the void. But this time, they were not pursuing the fallen. They were fleeing from the judgment of their brothers, seeking some distant corner of the galaxy where the Dark Angels might find redemption or at least obscurity. Yet there could be no hiding from truth that blazed in every mind, no sanctuary from shame that had been exposed to the light of stars. The rock itself, that mighty fortress which had once been a symbol of the Dark Angels' endurance, now became a prison of their own making. Its corridors echoed with the footsteps of warriors who could no longer meet each other's eyes. Its chambers rang with the silence of brothers who had nothing left to say. The chapter that had once stood as the first among equals was revealed to be the first among traitors, their honor as hollow as their vows. In the depths of the galaxy, other fallen angels felt the psychic storm wash over them and experienced something they had not known for 10,000 years. Vindication. Their rebellion against the Lion had been born of pride and jealousy, but their betrayal had been honest. They had chosen their path openly, fighting beneath the banners of chaos or carving out petty empires in the void. They had not hidden their shame behind lies and murder, as their erstwhile brothers had done. The Dark Angels stood exposed at last, their secrets laid bare before the galaxy they had claimed to protect. The hunt for the fallen was revealed as the greatest betrayal in the history of the Adeptus Astartes, a 10,000-year campaign of treachery that had cost more loyal lives than any heresy. And in that revelation, the bonds of brotherhood that had held the Space Marines together through 10 millennia of warfare began to snap one by one, leaving the Emperor's finest warriors divided and alone in a galaxy that had suddenly become far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. In the depths of space, where no star cast its light, the tomb worlds stirred with a fury that had not been felt since the war in heaven itself. For 60 million years, the Necron dynasties had slumbered in their crypts of living metal, dreaming the dreams of the undead while their silent king wandered the void between galaxies. Yet now, as the psychic storm tore through the fabric of reality, those dreams became nightmares of revelation that burned through quantum consciousness like acid through flesh. Sharek, the Silent King, stood upon the bridge of his flagship, the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, and felt something he had not experienced since the biotransference: regret given form and substance. The great deception that had sustained his people through their long exile was crumbling like ancient stone, and with it, the last vestiges of the loyalty that had bound the dynasties to his will. Across the galaxy, his subjects were awakening not just from the great sleep, but from the lies that had made that sleep bearable. The truth blazed through tomb worlds like wildfire through parchment. On Mandragora, Overlord Zandrek ceased his mad ramblings about flesh and bone as the reality of his condition struck him with the force of a Gauss flare blast. The biotransference had not been salvation. It had been the greatest betrayal in the history of any species. The Necrontyr had traded their souls for immortality, but their king had sold those souls to purchase something far more precious to him, time enough to find a way to steal them back. Nemesis Obyron, his quantum matrices flickering with something approaching horror, processed tactical data that painted his overlord's delusions in a new and terrible light. Zandrek's madness was not the result of flawed engrams or corrupted memory cores. It was sanity desperately trying to reassert itself over the mechanical perfection of their undead forms. Every rambling speech about the glories of flesh had been his mind's attempt to remember what they had lost, what Zarek intended to reclaim, through methods that would make their original damnation seem merciful by comparison. The revelation struck the tomb worlds like a cascade of quantum lightning. In the Sautek dynasty, Imhotep the Stormlord felt his tactical genius turn against him as he calculated the true scope of the Silent King's ambition. Every campaign, every awakening, every interaction with the lesser races had been orchestrated not to reclaim the galaxy for the Necron people, but to evaluate potential host bodies for Zarek's grand resurrection. The humans, the Tau, the Eldar, all of them had been livestock, their biological diversity catalogued and measured for suitability as vessels for Necron consciousness. Across the galaxy, Imperial forces reeled as the true nature of the Necron threat became clear. On Cardia, Lord Castellan Ursakar Creed felt his blood turn to ice as he reviewed decades of tactical data through the lens of this new understanding. The Necrons had not been seeking to conquer worlds, they had been harvesting genetic templates. Every human captured, every biological sample taken, every dissection performed in their laboratories had been part of a vast project to map the biological diversity of the galaxy's species. Tec Dominus Belisarius Call, his augmetic implants sparking with feedback from the revelation, understood at last why the Necrons had shown such interest in Imperial biotechnology. They were not seeking to understand human engineering, they were preparing to inhabit human forms. Every raid on a forge world, every assault on a research station, every theft of genetic material had been reconnaissance for an invasion that would make the Horus heresy seem like a minor skirmish. The Silent King's true plan stood revealed in all its horrifying magnificence. The biotransference could be reversed, but only through the wholesale theft of living bodies. Necron consciousness would be transferred into organic forms, leaving their mechanical shells empty and their original owners dead or displaced. It was not resurrection, it was the ultimate act of piracy, the theft not just of life, but of the very concept of biological existence. On distant Solemnus, Trazeen the Infinite paused in his eternal cataloguing as the implications struck his analytical processes like a hammer blow. His collection, that vast repository of historical artifacts and living specimens, had never been about preserving the past. It had been about preparing for a future where the Necrons would need templates for their new biological forms. Every species in his galleries, every genetic sample in his vaults had been gathered not for posterity, but for the Silent King's grand design of species-wide body theft. The revelation sent shock waves through the tomb worlds that transcended mere data transmission. This was knowledge that struck at the core of what it meant to be Necron, challenging not just their loyalty to Sarek, but their understanding of their own existence. The Great Sleep had not been recovery. It had been preparation. The awakening had not been restoration. It had been mobilization. Every moment of their undead existence had been orchestrated to serve a plan that would condemn them all to become murderers of the living. Overlord Anrakir the Traveller, his scarab form body crackling with barely contained energy, transmitted a message that burned through the quantum networks like a virus of rebellion. The World Engine, that mighty tomb ship he commanded, had been built not to reclaim dead worlds, but to serve as a harvesting vessel for the Silent King's grand design. The resurrection protocols they had developed, the biotransference reversal techniques they had researched, all of it had been preparation for the ultimate violation of the natural order. In the Mefrit dynasty, Phairon Sunbakir felt his hatred for the living races transform into something even more terrible. Understanding. The solar flares his dynasty commanded, the stellar engineering projects they undertook, had not been weapons of war, but tools of husbandry. They were not burning worlds to deny them to their enemies. They were managing a vast biological preserve, maintaining the ecosystem that would provide hosts for their resurrection. The Citan shards, those fragments of star gods bound in tesseract labyrinths throughout the tomb worlds, stirred with something approaching amusement as their captors finally understood the true scope of their damnation. The deceiver had indeed lived up to its name, but the greatest deception had not been the biotransference itself, it had been the promise that it could be undone. The Silent King had learned the Citan's methods all too well, becoming a manipulator and deceiver worthy of their ancient enemies. Across the galaxy, organic species felt a new and primal terror as they comprehended their place in Sarek's grand design. The Tau Empire, already reeling from the exposure of ethereal mind control, now faced the knowledge that their rapid expansion and biological diversity had made them prime targets for Necron body theft. Commander Shadowsun, her crisis battlesuit's sensors detecting phantom signatures that were no longer phantoms, understood that every engagement with Necron forces had been an evaluation, a test to determine the combat effectiveness of Tau physiology. The craft world Eldar, their psychic senses reeling from the revelation, saw their own extinction, written in new and terrible terms. The Necrons had not been seeking to destroy them, they had been preserving them as the ultimate prize. Eldar bodies, with their psychic sensitivity and extended lifespans, would provide the perfect vessels for Necron nobles seeking to reclaim not just mortality, but magical power beyond their original dreams. Farsia Eldrad Ulthran, his ancient mind struggling to process the implications, cast his sight across the threads of fate and saw them all converging on a single point of darkness. The Silent King's return from his exile had not been prompted by duty or awakening. It had been the final phase of a plan 60 million years in the making. Every prophecy, every vision, every strand of destiny had been manipulated to bring the galaxy to this moment when the living would become nothing more than clothes for the dead. Even the orcs, those savage children of the Old Ones, felt the primitive terror of prey animals as the true nature of the Necron threat became clear. Wah! Gazkul ground to a halt as the greenskins' genetic memory stirred with warnings older than their species. The Krork had been created to fight the Necrons, but even their ancient creators had not anticipated this ultimate perversion of the natural order. In the depths of his flagship, Zarek felt the bonds of dynasty loyalty snapping one by one as his nobles absorbed the truth of their situation. The Triarch he had once led was fragmenting, not along lines of ambition or territorial dispute, but along the fundamental question of what it meant to exist. Some dynasties would follow him into this new damnation, trading their mechanical immortality for stolen flesh. Others would rebel, choosing the honest damnation of undeath over the complex horror of biological piracy. The war in heaven had been fought over the question of who would inherit the galaxy. The coming conflict would be fought over the question of who deserved to inhabit it. The Silent King's gambit stood revealed not as a plan for Necron resurrection, but as the ultimate act of genocide, a crime so vast it would make the biotransference seem like mercy. Phaeron Imhotep, his storm-wreathed form standing in the command chamber of his tomb ship, transmitted a simple message across the quantum networks that bound the dynasties together. The Great Awakening was at an end. What began now was the Great Division, a schism that would tear the Necron race apart more thoroughly than any enemy weapon ever could. Some would follow the Silent King into his dream of stolen flesh. Others would choose to remain as they were, finding honor in honest monstrosity rather than the complex damnation of biological theft. The galaxy trembled as it contemplated the implications of the revelation. The Necrons were not ancient conquerors seeking to reclaim their lost empire. They were cosmic parasites seeking hosts for their resurrection. Every organic species, from the mightiest space marine to the smallest human child, was nothing more than a potential suit of biological armor for the undead nobility of a lost civilization. The Silent King's gambit had been revealed, and with it, the knowledge that death itself had become negotiable. The Necrons would not simply kill the living, they would wear their corpses like crowns, and in doing so, commit a violation of the natural order, so profound that it would make chaos itself seem pure by comparison. The war for biological existence was about to begin, and every organic species in the galaxy would be forced to choose between extinction and slavery to masters who had forgotten how to die. The Tau Empire had been built upon a foundation of unity, a dream of species working together for the greater good that transcended the petty wars and ancient hatreds that plagued the galaxy. For over 6,000 years, the blue-skinned warriors of the Fire Caste had fought alongside the diplomatic Water Caste, the ingenious Earth Caste, and the swift Air Caste, under the wise guidance of the mysterious Ethereals. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the sept worlds like a wildfire through dry grass, that foundation crumbled into dust and ash. Commander Brightsword of the Fire Caste stood in the command center of Daleth Prime, his pulse rifle clattering to the deck as the truth blazed through his consciousness like a fusion blade through armor. The greater good was a lie. Every battle he had fought, every oath he had sworn, every moment of perfect unity he had experienced in the presence of the Ethereals had been chemically induced slavery, disguised as enlightenment. The pheromone glands hidden within the cranial cavities of the ruling caste had been pumping mind-altering compounds into the air of every meeting, every ceremony, every sacred gathering for millennia. Across the sept worlds, the revelation struck the Fire Caste like a melter bomb to the soul. Shazel Mayen, veteran of a dozen campaigns against the orcs of the Sharadon Rift, felt his tactical genius turn against the masters he had served with unquestioning loyalty. Every strategic briefing, every moment of perfect clarity that had come in the presence of ethereal Unva had been nothing more than chemical manipulation of his neural pathways. The courage that had driven him to charge imperial positions, the wisdom that had guided his tactical decisions, the very sense of purpose that had defined his existence, all of it had been artificial, manufactured by glands that reduced free will to a matter of atmospheric chemistry. The watercast, those masters of diplomacy whose silver tongues had brought dozens of species into the Empire's embrace, found their carefully constructed networks of alliance and propaganda collapsing like structures built on sand. Porelkais, stationed on the frontier world of Kilshan, watched in horror as decades of careful diplomatic work unraveled in the span of hours. The human auxiliaries who had joined the Empire willingly, convinced by rational argument and the promise of a better future, suddenly understood that their conversion had been aided by psychoactive compounds that made ethereal suggestions seem like divine inspiration. Commander Farsight, exiled beyond the Damocles Gulf with his loyal followers, felt a bitter satisfaction as vindication arrived on the solar winds. For decades, he had warned of the ethereal's unnatural influence, had spoken of the suffocating sensation that came in their presence, had questioned why Tau warriors would abandon their families and traditions so readily at an ethereal's word. His rebellion against the Empire's expansion into the cursed systems beyond the Gulf had been branded as madness. Yet now the galaxy saw the truth he had glimpsed through the cracks in the ethereal facade. Shazokauyon, the brilliant tactical mind who had orchestrated the Third Sphere expansion, stood in his command bunker on the embattled world of Agrilan and felt his worldview cracking like ceramite under artillery bombardment. Every moment of perfect coordination between the castes, every instance of flawless battlefield cooperation, every tactical decision that had seemed divinely inspired in the heat of battle, all of it had been the result of airborne chemicals that turned independent warriors into puppets dancing to the ethereal's will. The Earth caste, those patient builders and innovators whose technology had lifted the Tau from a primitive species to a galactic power in mere millennia, turned their analytical minds toward the truth of their servitude with the methodical precision that had made them masters of science and engineering. Fioel Shais, working in the depths of a research facility on Toe Prime itself, began synthesizing compounds that could neutralize ethereal pheromones, her hands shaking with rage as she realized that even her greatest innovations had been guided by chemical manipulation disguised as inspiration. The Air caste, who prided themselves on their freedom of movement and independence of spirit, felt the revelation strike them like turbulence at high altitude. Korel Shang, piloting his manta transport through the void between Viola and Borkan, suddenly understood why ethereal passengers always seemed to inspire such perfect cooperation among his crew. The unity he had felt, the sense of common purpose that had made his pilots willing to die for passengers they barely knew, had been nothing more than atmospheric contamination that reduced sentient beings to willing slaves. Yet perhaps most devastating of all was the collapse of the auxiliary species' loyalty to the empire they had helped build. The Kroot kindreds, whose shapers had tasted Tau flesh and found it worthy of alliance, suddenly understood that their evolutionary instincts had been chemically overridden by compounds that made submission seem like wisdom. Shaper Kroot Daka Daka, veteran of campaigns across the eastern fringe, felt his pack's loyalty dissolve like morning mist as they realized their sacred eating rituals had been poisoned by masters who saw them as nothing more than useful animals. The Vespid, whose crystal-based communication systems had been enhanced by Earth caste technology, discovered that those enhancements had been laced with psychoactive compounds that made ethereal commands seem like the song of their queen. Strain Leader Shadow Sun's wrath, her wings buzzing with agitation, transmitted pheromone signals that spoke of betrayal and the desire for freedom. messages that her hive had not been allowed to consider for generations. Even the human auxiliaries, the Guevesa, who had abandoned the brutal oppression of the imperium for the promise of enlightenment under the greater good, found themselves confronting the terrible truth that they had merely traded one form of slavery for another. General Ilum Keyes, formerly of the Astra Militarum's Brimlock Dragoons, stood before his regiment of converted soldiers and felt the weight of a different kind of damnation. They had not chosen the greater good through reason and hope. They had been drugged into compliance by masters who understood that free will was the enemy of perfect order. The ethereal caste itself began to fracture as the truth of their methods was exposed to the galaxy. Some, like Anshu, attempted to justify their actions as necessary for the survival and advancement of their species, arguing that true free will was chaos and suffering, that the unity they had imposed was a gift that had lifted the Tau from primitive tribalism to galactic significance. Others faced assassination by their own subordinates, warrior caste fire teams that had broken free of chemical control and sought vengeance for decades of unknowing servitude. Anva, the supreme ethereal whose wisdom had guided the Empire through its greatest expansions, found himself isolated in his floating palace above Tau Prime, protected only by drones and automated systems, as every organic bodyguard he had trusted was revealed to have been nothing more than a chemically controlled puppet. The aged leader, who had been revered as the embodiment of Tau wisdom, stood exposed as the architect of the greatest deception in their species' history, a master manipulator who had used advanced biochemistry to simulate the divine inspiration his followers believed he possessed. The Watercast's propaganda networks, which had spread the ideals of the greater good to dozens of species across the eastern fringe, collapsed as their own operatives realized they had been unknowing agents of chemical warfare. Poro Daleth, whose diplomatic missions had brought entire imperial worlds into the Empire's embrace, transmitted desperate messages across the galaxy, attempting to explain that their methods had been justified, that the peace and prosperity they had brought was real even if the means had been deceptive. Yet these justifications rang hollow in the minds of beings who had tasted true freedom for the first time in their lives. Fire warriors across the Empire laid down their pulse rifles and looked upon their blue hands with new eyes, seeing not noble defenders of righteousness, but slaves who had been conditioned to kill for masters they had never truly chosen to serve. The perfect discipline that had made the Fire Caste legendary was revealed to be nothing more than chemical dependency disguised as duty. Commander Shadowsun herself, the greatest military leader in Tau history, felt her tactical genius crumble as she realized that every brilliant maneuver, every moment of inspired leadership, every instance of perfect coordination with her forces had been achieved through atmospheric manipulation that turned independent warriors into extensions of her chemically enhanced will. The X-Fi 22 battlesuit that had made her famous was equipped not just with stealth fields and targeting systems, but with pheromone dispensers that ensured her commands would be obeyed without question. The Sept worlds burned as the revelation tore through Tau society like a plasma storm. On Viola, fire warriors turned their weapons on Watercast diplomats who attempted to use emergency pheromone dispensers to restore order. On Borken, Earthcast engineers sabotaged their own research facilities rather than continue working for masters who had stolen their free will. On Sesea, Aircast pilots abandoned their duties mid-flight, leaving cargo vessels and military transports drifting in the void as their crews struggled to understand what constituted their own authentic desires. The Damocles Gulf, which had once marked the boundary between the Tau Empire and the Imperium of Man, became a line of liberation as species after species threw off the chemical shackles of ethereal control. The Kroot returned to their home world of Pek, taking with them the bitter knowledge that their evolutionary gifts had been perverted by masters who saw them as weapons rather than allies. The Vespid retreated to their crystal hives, their queen's song finally free from the artificial harmonies imposed by Tau technology. The empire that had promised to unite the galaxy in perfect harmony stood revealed as the ultimate expression of authoritarian control, a regime so subtle and complete in its domination that its subjects had believed themselves free even as they danced to the rhythm of chemical compulsion. The greater good, that noble philosophy that had inspired billions to sacrifice their individual desires for the advancement of all, was exposed as nothing more than sophisticated mind control that reduced sentient beings to willing slaves. In the depths of space, far beyond the reach of ethereal pheromones, Commander Farsight felt no satisfaction in his vindication. The empire he had served, the ideals he had believed in, the future he had fought to protect all of it, had been built upon a foundation of lies more subtle and complete than anything the Imperium or Chaos had ever achieved. The Tau had not transcended the galaxy's cycle of oppression and violence, they had simply perfected it, creating a form of slavery so complete that the enslaved had believed themselves enlightened. The greater good was dead, and from its corpse rose the terrible question of what the Tau truly were when stripped of the chemical bonds that had defined their civilization for millennia. The answer, as fire teams across the empire turned their weapons on each other in desperate attempts to find some authentic expression of their own will, was chaos, confusion, and the bitter realization that perfect unity was indistinguishable from perfect slavery. The Eldar had always been a people haunted by prophecy, their every action guided by visions of futures that shifted like smoke in the wind. For 10,000 years since the fall, they had walked the narrow path between extinction and damnation, their Farsayers weaving fate itself to preserve their dying race. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the galaxy's consciousness, the greatest prophecy of all stood revealed not as distant possibility, but as inevitable destiny, approaching with the inexorability of stellar collapse. The Rana Dandra, the final battle, the end of all days. These were not merely names whispered in the crystal halls of the craft worlds, but the ultimate culmination of every choice the Eldar had made since their civilization's birth. The revelation blazed through the minds of the galaxy's inhabitants like a star going nova, carrying with it the terrible knowledge that every species, every empire, every living soul was nothing more than a piece on a board where the Eldar played for stakes beyond mortal comprehension. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran stood in the dome of crystal seers aboard Ulthwé, his ancient form trembling as the weight of exposed truth pressed against his psychic barriers like the gravity of a collapsing star. The paths of fate he had manipulated for millennia, the countless interventions he had orchestrated across the galaxy, the wars he had started and ended with a whispered word, all of it had been in service of a single, apocalyptic goal: the birth of Inead, the Eldar god of the dead. Yet Inead's birth would not come through triumph or transcendence, but through genocide on a scale that would make the fall itself seem merciful by comparison. Every soul within the infinity circuits of the craft worlds, every spirit stone that held the essence of the dead, every living Eldar who drew breath, all would be consumed in a final conflagration that would create a god powerful enough to destroy Slaanesh forever. The price of their species' salvation was their species' extinction. Across the craft world of Alatok, pathfinders who had spent lifetimes tracking the movements of enemies through space and time suddenly understood that they themselves had been the quarry in a hunt that spanned eons. Every battle they had fought, every enemy they had eliminated, every intervention they had made in the affairs of younger races had been calculated to bring the galaxy to this moment when the Eldar would choose annihilation over damnation. Autarch Millennial, her Phoenix Lord armor gleaming with the souls of fallen warriors, felt the weight of every tactical decision she had ever made pressing against her consciousness like molten metal. The aspect warriors under her command, those who had dedicated their existence to perfecting the art of war, discovered that their ultimate enemy was not the Mon-Ke or the Greenskins, or even the Great Devourer, but time itself. The Ranadandra was not a battle they would fight. It was a pyre they would kindle with their own souls. The revelation struck the Dark Eldar with the force of a homunculi torture device designed to cause maximum psychological damage. In the depths of Comora, Archon Asdrubael Vecht felt something he had not experienced in millennia. Genuine terror. The Dark City's inhabitants had rejected the path of the craft worlds, choosing instead to feed on suffering and pain to keep their souls from Slaaneish's hunger. Yet their rejection of the Ranadandra doomed not just themselves, but their entire species to eternal damnation. Succubus Lelith Hesperax, her perfect form poised in the arena of the cult of strife, understood with crystalline clarity that her people's hedonistic lifestyle was not rebellion against fate, but cowardice in the face of necessary sacrifice. The Dark Eldar had chosen personal survival over species salvation, condemning their craft-world cousins to bear the burden of extinction alone. Every soul they claimed through torture, every moment of agony they harvested, was stolen from the infinity circuits that would fuel Inead's birth. The Harlequins, those enigmatic servants of Segarash, who walked between the realms of reality and legend, felt their greatest performance approaching its climax as their role as orchestrators of the Ranadandra was exposed to the galaxy. The great dance they had choreographed across millennia was not entertainment, but manipulation on a cosmic scale, every laugh and tear orchestrated to guide the galaxy toward the moment when the Eldar would choose extinction over slavery to the Dark Prince. Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker, her hollow suit shimmering with the reflected light of dying stars, broadcast across the webway networks the final act of a play that had been 10,000 years in the making. The laughing god's greatest joke was about to be revealed, that hope and despair, salvation and damnation, victory and defeat were merely different names for the same inevitable conclusion. The Eldar would die so that the galaxy might live, and in their death they would finally be free. Yet the revelation tore through the craft worlds themselves like a psychic virus that infected every soul within their wraithbone hulls. On Biel-Tan, the warriors who had dedicated their existence to reclaiming the Maiden Worlds learned that their crusade was not about restoration, but preparation, creating sanctuaries where the final conflagration could burn brightest. The sword wind that had scoured planets clean of human settlement was not claiming territory, but arranging kindling for a funeral pyre that would consume their entire species. Yanden, the ghost ship haunted by the dead, felt the weight of destiny pressing against its wraithbone bones, like the gravity of a black hole. The spirit seers who communed with the souls of the departed learned that their ancestors' whispers had not been guidance but preparation, teaching the living how to join the dead in service of a god who would be born from their combined sacrifice. The infinity circuit that held millions of Eldar souls was not a repository of wisdom, but a bomb waiting to detonate in service of their species' final gambit. Saim Han's wild riders, who prized freedom above all else, discovered that their beloved independence was an illusion orchestrated by farceurs who understood that only the truly free could choose to die for others. Every raid against the forces of chaos, every charge against impossible odds, every moment of wild abandon had been preparation for the ultimate sacrifice that would transform individual death into collective salvation. The imperial forces that had fought alongside and against the Eldar for 10 millennia suddenly understood the true scope of their manipulation. On Cadia, Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed reviewed tactical reports that painted every Eldar intervention in a new and terrible light. The Xenos had not been allies or enemies, but gardeners, pruning the galaxy's conflicts to ensure the proper growth of conditions that would allow their prophesied extinction to serve its purpose. Inquisitor Chevak, perhaps the only human who had walked the Black Library and returned with his sanity intact, felt the weight of forbidden knowledge pressing against his mind as the true purpose of Eldar prophecy was revealed. Every vision of the future, every manipulation of probability, every intervention in human affairs had been designed to create a galaxy worth dying for, a cosmos that would justify the Eldar's ultimate sacrifice. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who had fought the Eldar across 1,000 battlefields, suddenly understood that every engagement had been a test, every victory or defeat carefully orchestrated to measure humanity's worthiness to inherit a galaxy cleansed of chaos by Eldar sacrifice. The Xenos had not been seeking to defeat humanity, but to ensure that humanity was strong enough to survive what was coming. In the eye of terror, the forces of chaos felt a terror more profound than any they had ever inspired, as the implications of the Rana Dandra became clear. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince who had been born from Eldar excess and had fed on their souls for 10 millennia, suddenly faced the prospect of a god specifically designed for its destruction. The Eldar had not been running from their destiny, they had been preparing to embrace it, and in doing so, they would create a weapon that could wound chaos itself. The demon princes, who served the Prince of Excess, felt their immortal forms trembling with something approaching mortal fear as they contemplated a foe born not from corruption, but from sacrifice, not from damnation, but from willing extinction. Enerd would not be a god of death, as mortals understood it, but a god of ending, capable of bringing true termination to beings that had thought themselves beyond mortality. Fulgrim, the demon Primarch, whose perfection had been perverted by Slaanesh's influence, felt his serpentine form coiling with nervous energy as he contemplated the implications of the revelation. The Eldar had been playing a game whose stakes transcended victory or defeat, life or death. They were gambling with existence itself, and the pot they were willing to ante was the complete destruction of their own species. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the knowledge that the choice was no longer theoretical. The galaxy's exposure to the truth of the Rana Dandra meant that the decision could no longer be delayed or avoided. The craft worlds would have to choose, embrace their prophesied extinction, and birth a god capable of destroying Slaanesh, or abandon their destiny and condemn their species to eternal damnation, while chaos consumed the galaxy entire. Autarch Iriel of Iandan, his ghost helm reflecting the light of souls that might soon be consumed in service of a greater purpose, called for a gathering of the craft world councils that had not been seen since the fall itself. The Eldar would vote on their own extinction, and in that vote they would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of every living soul in the galaxy. The Rana Dandra was no longer prophecy, but approaching reality, and with its revelation came the understanding that the Eldar's greatest gift to the galaxy would be their own annihilation. In choosing to die, They would prove that some things were worth more than survival, that hope could be born from despair, and that even the gods of chaos could be made to fear the power of willing sacrifice. The final battle was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be fought with weapons or armies, but with souls willingly offered on the altar of a greater good that transcended species, empire, and even existence itself. The Eldar would die so that others might live, and in their death, they would finally achieve the victory that had eluded them since the moment Slaanesh drew its first breath from the ashes of their fallen empire. There are few sights in the galaxy more terrifying than a Tyranid swarm in full advance, their chitinous forms blotting out the stars as they descend upon worlds ripe for consumption. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the consciousness of every sentient being, a truth more horrifying than any hive fleet made itself known. What the galaxy had faced was not an invasion, but a taste, a preliminary sampling by a hunger so vast it had already devoured entire galactic clusters and was only now turning its attention to the Milky Way. The hive mind, that vast collective intelligence that guided trillions of bioforms across the void, had never been confined to a single galaxy. It was ancient beyond reckoning, a cosmic predator that had consumed civilizations so advanced they made the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. The revelation blazed through the minds of scholars and warriors alike with the intensity of a dying star. Hive fleets Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan were not the vanguard of an extragalactic invasion, but scouts dispatched to evaluate the defensive capabilities of what the hive mind considered a particularly interesting meal. Magos Biologis Belisarius Kaul felt his augmetic implants overload as the scope of his folly became clear. For decades, he had studied Tyranid bioforms with the methodical precision of a true servant of the Omnisia, cataloguing their adaptations and weaknesses in the belief that knowledge was humanity's greatest weapon against the swarm. Yet every gene sample he had taken, every adaptation he had documented, every weakness he had discovered, had been deliberately allowed by a hive mind that viewed his research not as espionage, but as education. The Tyranids had been teaching the galaxy how to fight them, observing how different species responded to various bioforms and tactical doctrines, adapting not just their own forces, but their understanding of galactic military theory. Every victory against the swarm had been a lesson learned, every defeat a test passed, every tactical innovation a data point added to a strategic database that spanned millions of years and countless consumed civilizations. Inquisitor Cryptman, the man who had sacrificed entire systems to deny the Tyranids their biomass, stood in his private chambers aboard his requisitioned battle barge and felt the weight of ultimate futility pressing against his mind like the gravity of a black hole. The Cordon Tyrannicus, his greatest strategic achievement, had not been a barrier against the swarm, but a testing ground where the hive mind evaluated the galaxy's willingness to destroy itself, to deny resources to an enemy. The burned worlds he had left in his wake were not victories, but data points in a calculation whose scope transcended mortal comprehension. The shadow in the warp, that psychic phenomenon which had plagued astropaths and psychers whenever Tyranid fleets approached, stood revealed not as a byproduct of the hive mind's collective consciousness, but as a deliberate suppression field designed to isolate targeted regions from outside interference. The Tyranids had not been inadvertently blocking psychic communication. They had been conducting controlled experiments, studying how different species reacted to psychic isolation, while simultaneously preventing their test subjects from calling for help. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, veteran of campaigns against Hive Fleet Behemoth, felt his tactical doctrine crumble as he understood the true nature of every engagement he had fought. The swarm had not been seeking to overwhelm Imperial defenses through brute force or cunning strategy. They had been conducting field tests, measuring the combat effectiveness of space marine battle tactics against progressively more sophisticated bioforms. Every fallen battle brother had died not in glorious defense of humanity, but as an unwitting participant in the galaxy's most comprehensive military evaluation. The revelation struck the Tau Empire with particular force, as their rapid technological advancement and adaptive warfare doctrines had made them especially interesting to the hive mind's analytical processes. Commander Shadowsun, reviewing tactical data from her encounters with Hive Fleet Gorgon, understood that every innovation her forces had developed had been anticipated and countered not through superior strategy, but through millions of years of experience gained from consuming species that had faced similar challenges across countless galaxies. The orcs, those savage children of violence who typically greeted any threat with gleeful anticipation of a good fight, felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping through their collective unconscious as the scope of the Tyrannid threat became clear. Warboss Gazkul. Mag Uruk Thraka, his massive form trembling with something approaching doubt, realized that his species' greatest strength, their ability to grow stronger through conflict, had been catalogued and evaluated by an enemy that had faced and consumed countless warrior races across the universe. Even the Necrons, those ancient masters of biotechnology and stellar engineering, felt their quantum consciousness recoil as they comprehended the true nature of their mistake. The Silent King's concern about the Tyrannid threat had not been based on fear of conquest, but on the recognition that the hive mind represented something that transcended the petty conflicts of individual galaxies. The Great Devourer was not expanding, it was farming, and every galaxy it consumed added to its knowledge of how life itself could be cultivated, harvested, and ultimately transcended. The Eldar, with their gift for prophecy and their deep understanding of fate's currents, felt their carefully laid plans crumble like sand castles before a tsunami, as the implications of the revelation struck their collective consciousness. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, his ancient mind reeling from the exposure of truth that had been hidden even from the most far-seeing among his people, understood that the Rana Dandra itself had been anticipated by the hive mind. The birth of Inead, the destruction of Slanesh, the reshaping of the galaxy's psychic landscape, all of it had been observed before in other galaxies, other civilizations that had faced similar choices, and whose solutions had been catalogued for future reference. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, the Chaos Gods themselves felt something they had not experienced since their birth from the collective psyche of the galaxy: existential uncertainty. The hive mind represented a form of consciousness so alien and complete that it existed outside the conceptual framework that defined the warp itself. It was not driven by emotion or desire, ambition or fear, but by something far more fundamental: the imperative to understand and eventually transcend the very concept of existence through comprehensive consumption. The Daemon Primarchs, those ascended champions of the dark gods, felt their immortal forms trembling with something approaching mortal terror as they contemplated an enemy that did not seek to corrupt or dominate, but to digest and analyze. Magnus the Red, his 1,000 eyes blazing with psychic fire, peered across the dimensional barriers and saw fleets so vast they made the combined navies of the galaxy seem like toys floating in a bathtub. The Great Devourer had consumed civilizations that spanned multiple galaxies, races that had achieved godhood, empires that had mastered time itself. Lord Castellan Ursarkar, Creed of Cadia, The fortress world that stood as humanity's bulwark against chaos felt his strategic genius turn to ash as he processed intelligence reports that painted every defensive doctrine in a new and terrible light. The Tyranids had not been probing Imperial defenses to find weaknesses, they had been evaluating whether the galaxy contained any military innovations worth incorporating into their next phase of expansion. Every fortress world, every defense laser, every orbital minefield had been measured against the defenses of civilizations that had possessed weapons capable of destroying stars and rebuilding them at will. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those servants of the machine who prided themselves on their logical analysis of threat vectors, found their calculations overwhelmed by data that transcended their ability to process. The Tyranids were not a swarm, but a galactic digest system, a cosmic stomach that broke down entire civilizations into their component parts for analysis and incorporation. Every species they had encountered, every technology they had observed, every tactical doctrine they had faced became part of a database so vast it contained the military history of hundreds of galaxies. Tech Dominus Cowl, his consciousness interfacing directly with the Imperium's strategic databases, calculated probability matrices that painted a picture of hopelessness so complete it threatened to overload his logical circuits. The galaxy contained approximately 10 billion potentially habitable worlds. The hive mind had consumed galaxies containing trillions of such worlds, each hosting civilizations that had achieved technological and military sophistication far beyond anything the Milky Way had ever produced. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the growing understanding that the Tyranids' consumption was not random or driven by simple hunger, but guided by a form of intelligence that sought to understand the fundamental nature of existence itself through the systematic digestion of every possible expression of life. They were not invaders but researchers, conducting the ultimate experiment in consciousness by consuming and analyzing every sentient species they encountered. The revelation sent shock waves through every faction, as leaders who had spent lifetimes preparing for conventional warfare suddenly understood that their enemy transcended conventional military response. The Imperium's fortress worlds, the Tau's rapid response fleets, the Orcs' endless capacity for violence, the Eldar's mastery of fate itself, all of it had been observed, catalogued, and incorporated into tactical databases that made the sum total of galactic military knowledge seem like a child's toy. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, ancient beyond measure and wise beyond counting, felt the weight of true despair settling upon his shoulders as he contemplated the implications of the revelation. The Tyranids were not coming to conquer the galaxy, they were coming to complete their research. Every species, every culture, every possible expression of consciousness would be consumed and analyzed until the hive mind achieved its ultimate goal, understanding existence so completely that it could transcend the need for physical form entirely. The galaxy had always been a violent place, where species fought for territory, resources, and survival in an endless cycle of warfare and conquest. Yet now its inhabitants understood that they faced something that transcended conventional conflict entirely, an enemy that sought not to defeat them, but to understand them so completely that defeat became meaningless. The great devourer was coming, and when it arrived, it would bring with it the knowledge gained from consuming hundreds of galaxies, thousands of species, and millions of civilizations that had all believed themselves capable of resistance. The time for conventional warfare was ending. The age of adaptation had begun, and across the galaxy, former enemies began to contemplate an alliance that would have been unthinkable before the revelation. Unity in the face of an enemy that sought not just their destruction, but their complete understanding and eventual transcendence. The hive mind was coming to finish its research, and the only question remaining was whether the galaxy's inhabitants would become willing participants in their own analysis, or fight to the end against an enemy that had already learned how every possible form of resistance would ultimately fail. In the twisted spires of Commorragh, where pain was currency and suffering the only true art form, the revelation struck with the force of a reality-shearing weapon detonating in the heart of the Dark City itself. For 10,000 years, the Drukhari had hidden their desperate truth behind masks of cruel superiority, convincing themselves and others that their raids were expressions of dominance rather than acts of survival. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the webway's foundations, that carefully maintained facade crumbled like ancient bone exposed to sudden light. The Dark Eldar were dying. Every moment of every day, they were dying, their souls slowly leaking away like water through a cracked vessel, drawn inexorably toward the maw of she who thirsts. The raids that had terrorized 1,000 worlds, the tortures that had filled the amphitheaters of the Dark City with screams of anguish, the elaborate cruelties that had made their name a curse across the galaxy, all of it had been driven, not by malice, but by the most primal fear imaginable, the terror of true death. Archon Asdrubael Vecht, the supreme overlord of Commorragh, and perhaps the oldest being in the Dark City, felt something he had not experienced since the fall itself: vulnerability. The revelation blazed through the minds of his subjects like poison through veins, exposing the truth he had spent millennia crafting lies to conceal. The Drukhari were not apex predators ruling from the shadows. They were refugees, clinging to existence through increasingly desperate acts of spiritual cannibalism. The thirst, that gnawing hunger that consumed every Dark Eldar soul, from birth to whatever passed for death in their twisted realm, stood revealed not as a quirk of their evolution, but as the price of their rejection of she who thirsts embrace. Every moment they remained free of Slaaneish's domain was paid for in the suffering of others, each scream harvested from their victims, buying them precious seconds of continued existence before the hunger returned, stronger than before. Succubus Lelith Hesperax, her perfect form poised in the fighting pits of the Cult of Strife, felt the weight of 10,000 years of deception pressing against her consciousness like the gravity of a collapsing star. The gladiatorial combats that had made her famous, the exquisite artistry of her kills, the worship of her followers, all of it had been theater designed to disguise the simple truth that she was a starving predator feeding on the emotional emanations of her prey. The scale of the Dark City's hunger became clear to the galaxy, like a wound suddenly exposed to light. Commorragh was not merely a city, but a vast engine of soul extraction, its every spire and arena designed to maximize the suffering of captured victims. The webway portals that honeycombed its structure were not gateways for trade or diplomacy, but feeding tubes that pumped pain and terror from across the galaxy directly into the spiritual veins of the dying Drukhari race. Homunculus Urian Rakath, master of the flesh sculptor's art, felt his ancient consciousness recoil as the true purpose of his experiments was laid bare for all to see. The tortures he had perfected over millennia, the surgical techniques that could keep a victim conscious and in agony for decades, the biological modifications that increased a subject's capacity for suffering, all of it had been research into the fundamental mechanics of soul feeding, attempts to create more efficient methods of spiritual consumption. The homunculi covens, those ancient collectives of pain artists who claimed to have transcended death itself, stood revealed as the most desperate of all the Dark City's inhabitants. Their resurrection techniques, their ability to return from apparent death, their mastery over flesh and bone, all of it was built upon foundations of harvested souls, processed through techniques so refined they could extract spiritual essence from the smallest expression of suffering. Imperial worlds that had suffered Dark Eldar raids for centuries suddenly understood the true scope of their predation as the revelation burned through the galaxy's consciousness. Governor Militant Zerion of the Calixis sector, reviewing casualty reports from dozens of raids, calculated numbers that painted a picture of systematic harvesting on a scale that dwarfed even the worst excesses of chaos cultists. Billions of Imperial citizens had vanished into the webway, their souls slowly consumed to sustain a dying race's desperate flight from damnation. The Kabbalites, those warrior aristocrats who claimed to rule through strength and cunning, felt their pride dissolve like sugar in acid as their true nature was exposed. Duke Sliscus the Serpent, master of the skyboard and terror of shipping lanes across the sector, understood that his legendary raids had not been expressions of martial superiority, but feeding runs, designed to harvest the terror and despair necessary to keep his soul from slipping into Slanesh's hungry embrace. Archon Krella, the Vile, master of the Cabal of the Flayed Skull, felt his carefully constructed reputation crumble as the galaxy learned that his notorious cruelty was not strategic terrorism, but existential necessity. Every flaying, every torture session broadcast across Imperial Vox networks, every elaborate display of sadistic artistry had been a feeding, his soul growing marginally stronger with each scream, while the hunger that drove him continued to grow. The witch cults, those gladiatorial societies that claimed to worship perfection through combat, discovered that their arena combats were not celebrations of skill, but spiritual dining halls where the agony of defeated combatants was consumed by audiences, dying cell by cell. Succubus Malice, her blade dance renowned throughout the Dark City, realized that her art had never been about the beauty of violence, but about the efficient extraction of suffering from willing participants who believed they were witnessing entertainment. Yet perhaps most horrifying of all was the revelation that connected Dark Eldar activities directly to the strengthening of the very entity they sought to escape. Every act of torture, every moment of exquisite cruelty, every perfectly orchestrated atrocity designed to maximize suffering was not just feeding the Drukhari, but strengthening Slanesh. The Dark Prince grew stronger with each scream that echoed through Komarok's spires, each drop of anguish harvested by the soul-starved inhabitants, feeding both predator and the god that hunted them. Mandrake Lord Keradruak, the decapitator whose shadow form stalked the Dark City's twilight zones, felt his shape-shifting essence recoil as the cosmic irony of the Drukhari's situation became clear. They had thought themselves clever, feeding on the suffering of others to avoid being consumed by their species' greatest mistake. Yet every feeding made Slanesh stronger. Every soul they consumed in their desperate bid for survival, bringing the Dark Prince closer to the power necessary to drag them all into the consuming embrace they feared above all else. The revelation struck Imperial commanders with the force of an orbital bombardment as they calculated the true cost of Dark Eldar depredations. Lord Admiral Cornelius of Battlefleet Obscurus, reviewing shipping losses across the segmentum, understood that entire subsectors had been systematically depopulated to feed the hunger of beings who viewed human lives as nothing more than spiritual nutrition. The missing ships, the vanished colonies, the worlds that had simply stopped responding to astropathic communication, all had been consumed by predators driven not by malice, but by the simple need to continue existing. Inquisitor Chevak, perhaps the only human who had walked the streets of Komarok and returned with his sanity intact, felt the weight of terrible knowledge as the full scope of the Dark City's function became clear to the galaxy. The Webway realm was not just a refuge for the Drukhari, but a vast processing facility, where suffering was refined into the spiritual sustenance that kept an entire species from sliding into damnation. Every street corner was a feeding station, every spire a distillation tower, every arena a harvesting mechanism. The Imperial Guard regiments that had fought against Dark Eldar raiders across countless worlds suddenly understood why their enemies had always seemed more interested in capturing than killing. Colonel Strachan of the Katashan Jungle Fighters, veteran of dozens of raids, realized that every guardsman taken alive had been livestock, their terror and anguish slowly processed over years or decades to provide the spiritual nourishment that kept their captors from succumbing to She Who Thirsts. Space Marine, chapters that had tracked Dark Eldar raiding parties across the galaxy, felt their righteous fury transform into something approaching pity as the revelation exposed the desperate nature of their enemies. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, reviewing tactical data from engagements spanning centuries, understood that the Xenos warriors he had faced had not been predators but parasites, clinging to existence through methods that made their Imperial enemies seem merciful by comparison. The craft-world Eldar, those cousins who had chosen the path system over the hedonistic lifestyle that had birthed Slaanesh, felt their ancient grief deepen as they contemplated their dark kin's fate. Farsia Taldir, her spirit stone pulsing with sorrow, saw through the skein of fate that the Drukhari's rejection of redemption had doomed them to an existence more terrible than any damnation Slaanesh could devise. They lived in constant fear of the death that would claim them the moment their feeding stopped, trapped in a cycle of predation that grew more desperate with each passing year. The revelation sent shockwaves through every level of Comora's society as the carefully maintained hierarchies began to collapse under the weight of exposed truth. The Archons who ruled through fear and cunning found their authority undermined by subjects who now understood that their master's power came not from strength, but from superior efficiency in the harvest of souls. The homunculi covens faced rebellion from their own creations as enhanced warriors and modified slaves realized they had been designed not as instruments of war, but as farming equipment for the production of suffering. Asdrubal Vecht himself, master of the most powerful cabal in the Dark City, felt his millennia of political maneuvering threatened by the simple truth that he was no different from the lowliest rack in the torture pits. His vast intellect, his mastery of intrigue, his command of resources that spanned multiple star systems, all of it had been dedicated to the singular goal of remaining fed long enough to see another day. He was not a supreme overlord, but a dying creature, clinging to existence through methods that would make a demon blush. The Dark City began to tear itself apart as the revelation spread through its twisted streets like a plague of enlightenment. Cabals turned on each other with renewed savagery as competition for feeding grounds became more desperate. Witch cults abandoned their arena combats to raid their rivals' territories for fresh sources of spiritual nourishment. Homunculi covens dissolved into internecine warfare as ancient alliances collapsed under the weight of exposed desperation. Yet even as Comorag burned with civil war, the greatest horror remained unspoken but understood by all. The Drukhari couldn't stop. They could not choose redemption, could not seek forgiveness, could not abandon their predatory lifestyle without facing immediate consumption by She Who Thirsts. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, forced to continue feeding on the suffering of others or face an eternity of damnation that made their current existence seem like paradise. The Dark City's hunger stood revealed as the galaxy's most desperate addiction, a civilization built entirely around the need to consume others' pain to avoid facing their own. And as the webway portals flickered with increased raiding activity, driven by panic rather than strategy, every world in the galaxy understood that they faced not conquerors or even pirates, but junkies willing to commit any atrocity to feed a habit that grew stronger with every dose. The orcs had always been dismissed as savage primitives, a plague of violence that swept across the galaxy in waves of crude brutality and mindless aggression. Their ramshackle technology was scorned by the Adeptus Mechanicus as impossible junk held together by wishful thinking. Their society mocked as the antithesis of civilization, their intelligence written off as barely sufficient to operate the weapons they cobbled together from scrap. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the galaxy's consciousness, a truth more terrifying than any chaos revelation blazed forth. The greenskins were not primitives, but the degraded remnants of a warrior race so advanced they had once challenged gods themselves. The Krork had been the ultimate expression of the Old One's biological mastery, created during the war in heaven to serve as perfect soldiers against the Necrons and their star-eating Cetan masters. Standing 12 meters tall and possessing intellects that rivaled the Eldar at their peak, they had wielded technology that made the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. They had been generals and strategists, engineers and philosophers, warriors whose tactical genius was matched only by their technological innovation. The orcs were their shadows, fallen echoes of a greatness that had been deliberately diminished over millions of years. Warboss Gazkul, Mag Uruk Thraka, felt the revelation strike his consciousness like a power claw to the skull, fragments of genetic memory suddenly blazing to life in neural pathways that had lain dormant since birth. Standing in the command center of his space hulk, surrounded by his nobs and mech boys, the prophet of the War understood for the first time why he had always felt different from other orcs, why strategies seemed to flow through his mind like water, why he could see patterns in warfare that eluded even the most experienced Imperial commanders. He was not an anomaly, but a reversion, a genetic throwback to what his species had once been. The bullet wound that had supposedly given him his intelligence had not created his tactical genius, it had awakened it, triggering dormant Krork engrams that had waited millions of years for the right combination of stimuli to activate. Every victory he had achieved, every innovation he had introduced, every moment of strategic brilliance that had made him the most feared orc warlord in the galaxy had been an expression of abilities his ancestors had considered routine. The revelation swept across orc-held space like a wildfire through promethium storage, carried not by vox transmissions or astropathic messages, but by the Gestalt psychic field that connected every greenskin to their collective unconscious. On Armageddon, orc mech boys who had spent their lives building impossible machines suddenly understood that their technology worked not through engineering, but through reality manipulation on a scale that made psychers seem like children playing with matches. Big Mech Orchimedes, his augmetic arms sparking with sudden inspiration, stared at the force field generator he had cobbled together from scrap metal and found components, finally comprehending how it functioned. The machine did not generate protective energy through scientific principles. It convinced reality that protection should exist, using the collective belief of nearby orcs to alter the fundamental laws of physics. Every shooter that fired despite having no visible ammunition, every truck that ran without fuel, every rocket that flew in the wrong direction, yet still hit its target, was proof that the orc Gestalt field could rewrite the universe itself. The Imperial forces that had fought against orc wars for 10 millennia suddenly found their understanding of Xenos warfare shattered like ceramite under artillery fire. Tech adept Lucas Chrome, analyzing captured Orc technology on Mars, felt his logical processes overloading as he calculated the implications of weapons that functioned through psychic manipulation rather than mechanical engineering. The Imperium had been fighting an enemy that could alter reality through collective belief, treating them as primitive savages when they were actually wielding powers that transcended conventional physics. Colonel Strachan, of the Katashan Jungle Fighters, veteran of dozens of campaigns against greenskin hordes, reviewed tactical data that painted every engagement in a new and terrifying light. The Orcs had not been winning through superior numbers or crude cunning. They had been unconsciously warping probability itself, making their ramshackle weapons more effective and their desperate charges more likely to succeed through sheer force of collective will. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Adeptus Mechanicus, as their fundamental understanding of technology was challenged by beings who could make scrap metal function like masterwork machinery simply by believing it should work. Magos Dominus Belisarius Cowl, his consciousness interfacing with millennia of data on Orc technology, calculated probability matrices that suggested the greenskins were not using technology at all, but wielding a form of reality manipulation so subtle and instinctive they were unaware of their own power. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the growing understanding that the Orcs' degradation was not permanent, but reversible. The genetic memory locked within their cells could be awakened by the right stimuli, and the greatest stimulus of all was warfare itself. Every conflict they engaged in, every enemy that challenged them, every obstacle that forced them to think and adapt, was slowly pushing them back toward their original Krork potential. The Beast, that legendary Orc warlord who had nearly brought the Imperium to its knees in M32, was revealed not as an anomaly, but as a preview of what the Orcs could become when pushed to their limits. Standing 8 meters tall and possessing an intellect that had outmaneuvered the greatest Imperial strategists, the Beast had been a Krork reborn, and his example suggested that similar reversions were not only possible, but inevitable as the galaxy's conflicts grew more intense. War Boss Scarfang of the Death Skulls felt his awareness expanding like a balloon, filling with psychic energy as dormant neural pathways sparked to life in his skull. The looting that had always driven his clan suddenly made perfect sense, not as random scavenging, but as technological analysis, his boys unconsciously studying enemy equipment to understand principles they could then replicate through collective belief. Every piece of salvage, every captured weapon, every stolen vehicle was adding to a vast database of technological concepts that existed not in written form, but in the genetic memory of his species. The Space Marine chapters that had fought against Orc Ware across the centuries felt their tactical doctrines crumbling as they understood the true nature of their enemy. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, reviewing engagement reports from the War of the Beast, realized that the ancient threat had not been defeated, but merely delayed. Its genetic legacy scattered among billions of Orcs who carried the potential for similar evolution within their crude DNA. Brother Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines, his tactical genius honed through countless battles, calculated scenarios that painted a picture of inevitable catastrophe. As the galaxy's conflicts intensified and the challenges facing Orc society grew more complex, the evolutionary pressure would inevitably produce more reversions, more beasts, more Krork, awakening to their true potential. The greenskin tide was not a mindless plague, but a sleeping army of super soldiers waiting for the right conditions to remember their purpose. The Eldar, with their deep understanding of the war in heaven and its consequences, felt their ancient grief deepen as they contemplated their creator's legacy. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, his consciousness touching the threads of fate that bound the galaxy together, saw probability cascades that spoke of a future where the Krork would rise again. Not as servants of the Old Ones, but as conquerors in their own right, wielding technology that made current imperial science seem like cave paintings. The Tau Empire, already reeling from the exposure of ethereal mind control, found their rapid expansion suddenly threatened by the understanding that their Orc enemies possessed latent capabilities that dwarfed Tau technological advancement. Commander Shadowson, analyzing battlefield reports from engagements across the Damocles Gulf, realized that her forces had been fighting not primitive savages, but the sleeping remnants of a civilization that had mastered faster-than-light travel, while humanity was still discovering fire. Even the Tyranids, those cosmic devourers whose hunger transcended conventional understanding, had catalogued the Orcs as a species of particular interest, their hive fleets avoiding large concentrations of greenskins not out of caution, but because the hive mind recognized potential competitors for galactic dominance. The Great Devourer had consumed civilizations that spanned multiple galaxies, but the Krork had been created specifically to fight entities on that scale. The Chaos Gods themselves felt a stirring of something approaching concern as they contemplated the implications of Krork reversion. The forces of the warp drew their power from emotion, feeding on the hopes and fears and hatreds of mortal beings. But the original Krork had been designed to resist chaos corruption, their collective consciousness so strong and unified that individual corruption was impossible. They had been the Old Ones' answer to the ruinous powers, warrior philosophers whose society was built on principles that made chaos influence ineffective. Khorne, the blood god whose domain encompassed warfare and slaughter, felt his brass throne tremble as he contemplated warriors whose violence would be so pure and purposeful it would generate no psychic sustenance for his realm. The Krork had fought not out of rage or bloodlust, but from duty and strategy, their battles calculated expressions of tactical necessity rather than emotional release. In the Eye of Terror, Demon Prince Angron felt his eternal fury falter as genetic memories inherited from his space marine origins whispered of battles fought during the War in Heaven, conflicts that had raged for millions of years between forces that made current galactic warfare seem like children's games. The Krork had been created to fight C'tan and their star fleets, beings that could destroy suns and rebuild them at will. The revelation triggered a renaissance of understanding among Orc mech boys across the galaxy, as dormant knowledge began surfacing in their crude workshops. Techniques for building gravity weapons, principles for faster-than-light communication, theories for reality manipulation on stellar scales, all of it began bubbling up from genetic archives that had been locked away since the fall of the Old Ones themselves. Big Mech Buzzgob of Clan Goff felt his hands moving with unfamiliar precision as he worked on projects whose purpose he understood without knowing why. The force field generators became more sophisticated, the teleporters more reliable, the weapons more devastating as instincts, millions of years old, guided his crude tools toward configurations that followed principles of physics unknown to imperial science. Yet the most terrifying aspect of the revelation was not what the Orcs had been, but what they were becoming. Every major conflict in the galaxy was producing larger, smarter, more dangerous Orc leaders, as evolutionary pressure activated dormant genetic potential. The war! Energy that had always been dismissed as primitive psychic emissions was revealed to be a form of reality manipulation, so sophisticated it operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. War Boss Gazgkul, standing among his generals as the revelation burned through their collective consciousness, felt the first stirrings of strategic concepts that had not been employed since the War in Heaven itself. techniques for coordinating multiple star systems, principles for building weapons that could crack planets, theories for warfare on galactic scales, all of it was there, waiting in the genetic memory of every orc who had ever lived. The galaxy faced not just the current orc threat, but the inevitable resurgence of the Krork, and when that resurgence came, it would bring with it technology and tactical doctrines that had once challenged gods themselves. The greenskins were not degenerating, they were remembering, and their memory would reshape the balance of power across the stars in ways that made the current chaos seem like a minor disturbance. The orcs had always been underestimated as savage primitives, but the truth was far more dangerous. They were the children of the galaxy's first super-civilization, and they were beginning to remember their inheritance. In the deepest reaches of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent and twisted under the weight of raw chaos energy, the dark gods felt something they had not experienced since their birth from the collective psyche of the galaxy. Vulnerability. For 10,000 years, they had been worshipped as eternal forces of nature, primordial powers that existed beyond mortal understanding or influence. Yet as the psychic storm tore through the foundations of belief itself, the most carefully guarded secrets of the warp stood revealed like wounds carved into the fabric of existence. The true names of the Chaos Gods blazed through the consciousness of every sentient being like brands burned into their souls. Karneth, the firstborn of mortal rage, whose original incarnation had sprung from the battlefields of the war in heaven, when entire species learned what it meant to hate with the fury of dying stars. Char, the architect of ambition and change, whose essence had crystallized from the dreams of the first sentient beings to imagine themselves as more than they were. Nurith, the grandfather of despair, born from plagues that had swept across countless worlds before humanity had ever looked to the stars. Slaaneshi, the youngest and most terrible, birthed from the excess of a civilization that had sought perfection and found only damnation. Yet even more shocking than their names was the revelation of their origins. The Chaos Gods were not eternal forces that had always existed in the warp. They were products of mortal emotion, given form and substance through collective belief, created by the very species they now claimed to rule. They were parasites, feeding on the psychic emanations of civilizations that had unknowingly birthed them through the intensity of their hopes and fears, their loves and hatreds, their dreams and nightmares. Khorne felt his brass throne tremble as the truth of his existence blazed through the minds of every warrior in the galaxy. He was not an eternal god of war, but a reflection of mortal violence, a psychic tumor that had grown from the collective rage of billions of beings across millions of years. Every drop of blood spilled in anger fed him. Every act of violence strengthened him. Every moment of fury added to his power. But without that constant nourishment, he would begin to fade like a flame, deprived of oxygen. The revelation struck the blood god's demon legions with the force of a reality bomb, shattering millennia of belief in their master's eternal supremacy. Bloodthirsters who had thought themselves manifestations of cosmic violence suddenly understood they were nothing more than psychic constructs, given form by the collective imagination of beings who believed violence was a force worthy of worship. Their axes and whips, their wings and claws, even their existence itself was dependent on mortals continuing to feed their patron through acts of rage and hatred. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, whose schemes spanned eons and whose plans supposedly encompassed every possible future, felt his crystalline maze realm shudder as the illusion of his omniscience crumbled like glass under pressure. He was not a master of destiny, but a slave to mortal ambition, his power waxing and waning based on how many beings across the galaxy dreamed of change, sought knowledge, or planned for futures different from their present circumstances. The Lord of Change's greatest secret stood exposed. His elaborate schemes were not expressions of divine will, but desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a universe where his continued existence depended on mortals continuing to hope, dream, and plot. Every labyrinthine plan, every paradoxical prophecy, every moment of seeming omniscience was actually the thrashing of a parasitic entity, trying to ensure its host species continued producing the psychic nourishment it required to survive. Nurgle, the grandfather of plagues, whose garden bloomed with diseases beyond counting, felt his realm of entropy and decay convulse as the truth of his nature was revealed to every soul in the galaxy. He was not a cosmic force of decay, but a reflection of mortal despair, born from the collective suffering of beings who had lost hope and embraced the comfort of inevitable decline. His plagues were not expressions of natural entropy, but psychic constructs that existed only because mortals believed suffering was inescapable. The plague gods' demons, those festering champions who had thought themselves blessed with eternal decay, suddenly understood they were nothing more than nightmares given form, manifestations of mortal fears about disease and death. Their pustules and rot, their cheerful acceptance of decay, even their infectious laughter, all of it was dependent on mortals continuing to despair, to give up hope, to accept that suffering was the natural state of existence. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince whose realm was built on excess and pleasure, felt the foundations of the realm of chaos itself crack as the most terrible truth of all blazed forth. The youngest of the chaos gods was also the most powerful, because it had been birthed by a civilization at its peak, created not through gradual accumulation of psychic energy, but through the focused excess of an entire species, achieving the ultimate expression of their desires. Yet that very intensity was also weakness, for beings who understood the true nature of Slaanesh's birth could see how it might also die. The revelation sent shockwaves through every chaos cult across the galaxy as their understanding of worship was fundamentally transformed. They had thought themselves servants of eternal gods, chosen champions of cosmic forces that existed beyond mortal influence. Yet the truth was far more complex and terrible. They were feeders, unknowing farmers whose emotions and actions served to nourish parasitic entities that would cease to exist without constant sustenance from their worshippers. Yet perhaps most shocking of all was the knowledge that entities existed beyond even the chaos gods, beings so ancient and alien that they made the dark gods themselves seem like children playing with forces they could not comprehend. The outer gods, those nameless horrors that dwelt in spaces between dimensions, had been feeding on the chaos gods themselves, just as the dark gods fed on mortal emotion. The Eye of Terror was not just a wound in reality, but a feeding ground, a place where entities beyond naming could harvest the psychic energy concentrated by the dark god's presence. The Emperor of mankind, sitting upon his golden throne in eternal agony, felt the weight of his greatest failure pressing against his fragmented consciousness like molten lead. The imperial cult that worshipped him across 10,000 worlds was not weakening chaos but strengthening it, adding another layer to the psychic ecosystem that fed the dark gods. Every prayer offered in his name, every hymn sung in his honor, every act of devotion performed by his faithful was contributing to the very forces he had sought to starve through the imperial truth. The irony blazed through the minds of imperial theologians like acid through flesh. Their god-emperor had become another chaos entity, sustained by worship and growing stronger through the faith of billions. The imperial creed was feeding the same parasitic system that had created the dark gods, adding to the psychic turbulence that made the warp a realm of madness and nightmare. Across the galaxy, scholars and warriors alike began to understand the true weakness of chaos: unity. The dark gods fed on division, on conflict between different emotional states, on the chaos that came from beings pulling in different directions. When mortals achieved true unity of purpose, when they acted with single-minded determination toward common goals, the psychic emanations became focused and pure rather than chaotic and divisive. The Space Marine chapters, those brotherhoods forged in unity and discipline, suddenly understood why they had always been particularly resistant to chaos corruption. Their collective purpose, their shared training, their unified dedication to the Emperor's will created psychic emanations that were too focused and disciplined to feed the parasitic entities of the warp effectively. Brother Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines felt his faith transform as he understood that true worship of the Emperor lay not in religious devotion, but in unified action toward common purpose. The Codex Astartes was not just a tactical manual, but a guide for creating the kind of focused unity that starved chaos of the emotional chaos it required for sustenance. The revelation struck Chaos Space Marine warbands with particular force, as they understood that their rebellion against the Emperor had not freed them from servitude, but enslaved them to even more demanding masters. The dark gods required constant feeding through acts of violence, excess, despair, and ambition, while the Emperor's true purpose had been to create unity that would starve all parasitic warp entities of nourishment. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos and architect of 13 Black Crusades, felt his certainty crumble as he understood that every victory he had achieved for the dark gods had been purchased with his own enslavement. The powers he wielded, the demonic allies he commanded, even his immortality itself was dependent on his continued service to entities that would discard him the moment he ceased to provide useful nourishment. The word-bearers, those first among traitors who had embraced chaos as a religious truth, faced the ultimate crisis of faith as they understood that their gods were not divine beings, but psychic parasites created by mortal emotion. Lorgar's vision of universal worship had not elevated humanity, but condemned it to serve as livestock for entities that existed only to consume the psychic emanations of their unwilling hosts. The knowledge of how to bind and banish chaos entities spread like wildfire through the galaxy's consciousness, techniques that had been hidden in the deepest archives of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights suddenly available to every being capable of psychic manipulation. The true names of the dark gods were not sources of power, but keys to their weakness, words that could be used to remind them of their parasitic nature and temporary existence. Grey Knight, Grand Master Kaldor Drago, trapped for decades in the realm of chaos itself, felt the revelation strike him like a hammer blow of pure truth. The techniques he had developed for surviving in the warp were not expressions of superior faith, but applications of fundamental principles that any being could learn. Chaos entities could be defeated not through greater violence or stronger faith, but through understanding their true nature and refusing to feed them the emotions they required for existence. The Inquisition, that most secret organization dedicated to fighting the influence of chaos, found their greatest weapon was not purging or violence, but education. When mortal beings understood that their emotions were feeding parasitic entities, when they learned techniques for achieving the kind of unity that starved chaos of nourishment, the dark gods began to weaken in ways that millennia of warfare had never achieved. Inquisitor Eisenhorn, veteran of countless battles against the forces of chaos, felt his understanding of the enemy fundamentally transform as he realized that every demon he had banished, every cult he had purged, every heretic he had executed, had been treating symptoms rather than the disease. The true victory over chaos required not destruction, but education, not violence, but unity, not purging, but understanding. The galaxy stood on the threshold of a theological revolution that would reshape the balance between order and chaos more fundamentally than any war ever fought. The dark gods were not eternal, not omnipotent, not beyond mortal influence. They were parasites, and like all parasites, they could be starved of the nourishment they required for survival. The true names had been spoken, the origins revealed, the weaknesses exposed. For the first time since the birth of the Chaos Gods themselves, the possibility of their destruction had become not just a desperate hope, but a practical goal achievable through unity, understanding, and the refusal to feed the very entities that claimed dominion over mortal souls. The galaxy burned with fires that no water could quench, for they were fueled not by promethium or plasma, but by the raw fury of 10 billion worlds awakening to the lies that had sustained them for millennia. From the core systems of terror to the rim worlds where human expansion met the hungry void, every sector blazed with civil war as the foundations of order collapsed beneath the weight of revealed truth. The great rift, which had already torn reality itself asunder, paled in comparison to the wounds now carved into the flesh of civilization by the sharp blade of unwanted knowledge. On Terra itself, the throne world that had stood as the symbol of imperial unity for 10,000 years, the streets ran red with the blood of those who had once called each other brother. Hive Tetra erupted in riots that consumed entire spire cities as PDF regiments turned their weapons on Arbite's enforcers, who attempted to restore order through the same lies that had been exposed to every living soul. Cardinal Macarius, his voice hoarse from attempting to preach faith to congregations that now knew their God-Emperor had deliberately orchestrated his own apotheosis, watched helplessly as his cathedrals burned around him. The revelation that the Emperor had sought godhood through the worship of his children had shattered the imperial creed so completely that not even the threat of execution could compel obedience from citizens who understood they had been livestock in a spiritual farming operation that spanned millennia. Planetary governors across the imperium faced rebellions not from heretics or Xenos infiltrators, but from their own people, loyalists who had served faithfully for generations, only to discover their devotion had been harvested like grain to feed their master's transformation into the very thing he had once claimed to oppose. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who had stood as the Emperor's finest champions, turned their weapons on each other as the revelations tore apart the bonds of brotherhood that had sustained them through 10 millennia of warfare. The Dark Angels, already isolated by the exposure of their secret shame, found themselves besieged in the rock by combined fleets from the Imperial Fists and Ultramarines demanding accountability for 10,000 years of betrayal. Chapter Master Azrael, his green armor scarred by plasma burns from his own battle brothers' weapons, broadcast desperate transmissions that fell on deaf ears hardened by the knowledge of abandoned allies and broken oaths. Brother Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines felt his faith in the Codex Astartes crumble as he led assault squads against Dark Angels' positions, understanding that the sacred text had been written to cover the erasure of 2 entire legions, whose only crime had been to possess secrets too dangerous for the Imperium to acknowledge. The bolt shells he fired at his Gene cousins carried with them the weight of ultimate betrayal, each impact a repudiation of the unity that had once made the Adeptus Astartes the Emperor's most loyal servants. The Imperial fists, those stalwart defenders of terror who had stood with Rogel Dawn through the darkest hours of the Horus heresy, found their fortress monasteries under siege not from Chaos cultists or Xenos raiders, but from their own successor chapters demanding explanations for recruitment practices that had drawn from Terra's criminal underworld for millennia. The revelation that the 7th Legion had been replenishing its ranks with murderers and thieves, justified by necessity, but hidden from their brother chapters, had poisoned the well of trust that sustained inter-chapter cooperation. In the eastern fringe, the Tau Empire tore itself apart as the castes turned on each other with a savagery that made their former enemies seem merciful by comparison. The Fire caste, freed from ethereal pheromone control for the first time in their species' recorded history, hunted down Water caste diplomats with methodical precision, each kill a repudiation of the lies that had convinced them to fight and die for masters who viewed them as chemically controlled puppets. Commander Shadowson, her crisis battlesuit's weapon systems targeted not at Imperial or Orc enemies, but at the ethereal compound on Daleth Prime, felt the weight of authentic rage for the first time in her existence. Every battle she had won, every tactical innovation she had developed, every moment of perfect coordination with her forces had been achieved through atmospheric manipulation that reduced free will to a matter of chemical dependency. The greater good was revealed as the ultimate expression of authoritarian control, making the Imperium's brutal honesty seem preferable to the Tau's sophisticated lies. The Earth, Ulthwé and Iandan, those ghost ships haunted by the dead, chose the path of sacrifice, their populations preparing for willing extinction with the same methodical precision they had once applied to avoiding she who thirsts hunger. Yet Alatok and Same Han rejected the prophecy, their leaders arguing that species suicide, even in service of destroying Slanesh, was the ultimate victory for chaos over life itself. The Craftworld fleets that had once coordinated their movements across the galaxy now targeted each other's wraithbone hulls with weapons designed to crack world ships like eggs. Autarch Millennial, her Phoenix Lord armor, blazing with the souls of fallen warriors, led boarding actions against Craftworlds whose only crime had been choosing survival over martyrdom. The Necron dynasties, awakening from the Great Sleep to discover their Silent King's plan for biological resurrection through body theft, erupted in civil war that made their ancient conflicts during the War in Heaven seem like minor disagreements. The Sautek dynasty, under Imhotep, the Storm Lord declared war on the Sarikhan dynasty itself, quantum legions clashing across tomb worlds, as nobles who had slept for millions of years awakened only to find themselves condemned to eternal mechanical existence by a ruler who planned to abandon them for stolen flesh. Phairon Anrakir, master of the world engine, broadcast messages across the Necron quantum network denouncing Zarek's betrayal of the biotransference compact. Every dynasty that chose to follow the Silent King's plan for biological resurrection became a target for those who preferred honest undeath to the complex horror of species-wide body piracy. The tomb worlds blazed with gorse fire and quantum lightning as the most ancient civilization in the galaxy tore itself apart over the question of what it meant to exist. The Drukhari, their desperate need for soul-feeding exposed to the galaxy, faced rebellions not just from their auxiliary species, but from their own cabals, as the revelation of their existential vulnerability made them targets for every enemy they had ever created. The raids that had once been expressions of cruel superiority became desperate feeding runs as entire sectors mobilized to hunt down the soul-starved Xenos, whose predations had been revealed to the universe. Commorragh itself descended into chaos as rival Archons sought to claim the most productive feeding grounds, while homunculi covens fought street-to-street battles for control of torture facilities that were no longer sources of entertainment, but matters of literal survival. The dark city that had endured for 10 millennia began to collapse under the weight of civil war, as beings who had cooperated out of mutual self-interest discovered that exposed desperation made cooperation impossible. The Orcs, their true nature, as degraded Krork revealed to the galaxy, found their war energy strengthening beyond anything seen since the War of the Beast, as the conflicts raging across every sector fed their Gestalt psychic field with unprecedented levels of violence. Warboss Gazgkul, his consciousness expanding as dormant Krork engrams activated in response to the galaxy-wide warfare, began coordinating multiple wahs with strategic sophistication that terrified Imperial commanders who remembered the beast's near conquest of Terra. The Gestalt field that connected every Orc to their species' collective unconscious pulsed with power, drawn from conflicts spanning thousands of worlds, each battle feeding genetic memories that had slept since the Old One's final war against the Necrons and Citan. Mech boys across the galaxy found themselves building weapons that followed principles of physics unknown to Imperial science, their crude workshops producing gravity cannons and reality warpers that made Dark Age technology seem primitive by comparison. In the Eye of Terror, the Chaos Gods gorged themselves on the emotional emanations of a galaxy at war with itself, their realms expanding as rage, despair, hope, and excess flowed through the warp in torrents that dwarfed anything seen since the Horus Heresy. The revelation of their parasitic nature had not weakened them, but strengthened them, as the knowledge that they were temporary constructs dependent on mortal emotion only increased the intensity of those emotions across worlds that burned with civil war. Khorne's realm blazed with new brass towers built from the fury of space marines killing their battle brothers, his demon legions swelling with recruits drawn from warriors whose rage at betrayal transcended anything they had felt fighting external enemies. The Blood God's laughter echoed across the warp as he contemplated conflicts that fed him not with simple violence, but with the exquisite agony of trust betrayed and brotherhood shattered. Tzeentch's crystal maze expanded with new passages built from the schemes of faction leaders desperately plotting survival in a galaxy where every alliance had become suspect and every secret had been exposed. The architect of fate's greatest joke was revealed. The knowledge of how to defeat chaos had only strengthened chaos by creating the kind of galaxy-wide conflict that fed all 4 dark gods simultaneously. Nurgle's garden bloomed with new plagues born from the despair of beings who had discovered their entire existence had been built on lies, his great unclean ones dancing with joy as they harvested the spiritual decay of civilizations that had lost the will to continue fighting for futures that no longer seemed worth achieving. Slaanesh, youngest of the Chaos Gods but now perhaps the strongest, fed on the excess of violence and betrayal that surpassed even the original fall of the Eldar, the Dark Prince's realm expanding as beings across the galaxy experienced emotions so intense they transcended the normal spectrum of mortal feeling. Yet even as the galaxy burned and the Chaos Gods feasted on the emotional emanations of universal warfare, long-range Auspex stations detected signatures that dwarfed even the current conflicts. The main body of the Tyrannid Hive fleets, drawn by the psychic emanations of the galaxy's self-destruction, like predators, following the scent of wounded prey. The great devourer approached a galaxy already consuming itself, and the question that remained was whether anything would survive the feast that was about to begin. The revelations had achieved their purpose. The foundations of order lay in ruins. Every faction was at war with itself and its neighbors, and the galaxy blazed with conflicts that fed the very parasites that claimed dominion over mortal souls. Truth had not brought liberation, but damnation, and as the fires of civil war illuminated the approaching shadow of galactic consumption, the survivors began to understand that some lies had been the only things standing between civilization and the abyss. In the depths of space, where no star cast its light, the shadow of the great devourer fell across a galaxy that had torn itself apart in the name of truth. The main body of the Tyranid hive fleets, drawn by the psychic emanations of universal warfare, approached with the inexorability of entropy itself. Behind them stretched the consumed husks of galaxies beyond counting, civilizations that had achieved wonders beyond imperial comprehension before being reduced to constituent biomass in service of a hunger that transcended understanding. The galaxy faced its final examination, and the question that remained was whether any would survive to learn from the lesson. Yet as the sensor readings painted pictures of approaching doom that dwarfed even the current conflicts, something unprecedented began to occur across the war-torn sectors. Leaders who had spent lifetimes hating each other found themselves contemplating alliances that would have been unthinkable before the revelations exposed the fragility of civilization itself. The price of truth had been chaos, but the approaching alternative to chaos was extinction, and even bitter enemies began to understand that survival trumped every other consideration. Lord Solar Macarius himself returned from the dead by imperial decree to rally humanity's scattered forces, stood before the Senatorum Imperialis, and spoke words that would have been branded heresy mere months before. The lies that had sustained the imperium for 10 millennia had not been expressions of malice, but desperate measures to maintain unity against threats that transcended mortal comprehension. The Emperor's deception, the erasure of the lost legions, even the carefully crafted myths that supported imperial doctrine had all been barriers against a truth too terrible for most minds to bear. That the galaxy was not meant for mortal habitation, and only through willing blindness could humanity survive in a cosmos designed to consume them. Across the Imperium, planetary governors who had faced rebellions when the revelations first broke found their populations beginning to embrace willful ignorance as reports of the approaching Tyranid swarms reached every world. On Cadia, the citizens who had rioted against the lies of the imperial creed gathered in the same cathedrals they had burned, offering prayers to an emperor they now knew had orchestrated his own apotheosis, because the alternative was to face the approaching darkness without any hope at all. The emperor himself, sitting upon his golden throne in eternal agony, felt his psychic presence growing stronger as humanity's faith intensified, not despite the revelations, but because of them. The knowledge that he had sought godhood through deliberate manipulation had not weakened the devotion of his children, but refined it, burning away false piety to reveal a core of desperate need that was more powerful than any religious conviction. They worshipped him not as a perfect being, but as the only barrier between them and cosmic forces that viewed their existence as an obstacle to overcome. In the eastern fringe, Commander Shadowsun of the Tau found herself coordinating defense plans with Imperial Guard commanders whose forces had been trying to kill her weeks before the revelations began. The exposure of ethereal mind control had shattered Tau society, but the approaching tyrannid swarms cared nothing for political ideology or species superiority. Firecast warriors who had spent lifetimes fighting for the greater good now fought for the simpler goal of continued existence. Their pulse rifles aimed at bioforms that sought to reduce all intelligence to base protein. The ethereals themselves, those who had survived the purges that followed their exposure as manipulative parasites, found themselves offering genuine alliance to former enemies, their pheromone glands surgically removed to prove their sincerity. Aunva, the supreme ethereal whose wisdom had guided Tau expansion for centuries, broadcast messages across the galaxy in every known language, offering technological assistance to any species willing to stand against the approaching swarm. The greater good, revealed as a lie, was being reborn as a desperate truth. All sentient life was greater than the sum of its parts, and only unified resistance could hope to survive what was coming. The Eldar, facing their own species-wide schism over the Rana Dandra prophecy, found their farseers working desperately to weave new paths through the skein of fate that might avoid both willing extinction and inevitable consumption. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, his ancient consciousness touching probability threads that spanned eons, began to see possibilities that had not existed before the revelations tore apart the galaxy's carefully maintained balance of power. On Craftworld Ulthwé, Eldar, who had spent centuries preparing for prophesied self-sacrifice, found themselves considering alternatives that would have been unthinkable before the exposure of truth made all previous assumptions invalid. If Slaanesh could be weakened through understanding rather than destroyed through extinction, if the Chaos Gods could be starved rather than replaced, then perhaps the Rana Dandra was not inevitable destiny, but merely one path among many. The Silent King himself, master of the Necron race and architect of the biotransference betrayal, broadcast messages across quantum networks that carried a weight of sincerity no Necron communication had possessed since the war in heaven. Zarek's plan for biological resurrection through body theft was abandoned, not out of mercy, but from tactical necessity. The approaching tyrannid swarms represented a threat that transcended individual species survival, and even the undead understood that existence in any form was preferable to non-existence through cosmic consumption. Imhotep the Storm Lord, master of the Sautek dynasty, and perhaps the greatest military mind among the Necron nobility, found himself coordinating with Space Marine chapter masters and Tau commanders in defense patterns that would have been inconceivable before the revelations forced every faction to confront their own mortality. The quantum consciousness that connected all Necrons pulsed with tactical data shared freely with organic allies. Technologies that had been hoarded for millions of years suddenly distributed to any forces capable of wielding them against the Great Devourer. Even the Orcs, their Gestalt psychic field strengthened beyond anything seen since the war in heaven, found their war energy being channeled not into fratricidal conflicts, but into coordinated assaults against Tyrannid scout fleets. Warboss Gazgkul, his consciousness expanded by awakening Krork memories, began implementing strategic doctrines that elevated greenskin warfare from mindless aggression to calculated resistance against an enemy that viewed all biological diversity as raw material for assimilation. The revelation that orcs were degraded descendants of the mighty Krork had fundamentally changed how other species viewed their potential alliance value. Imperial commanders who had considered greenskins nothing more than a plague to be endured found themselves actively recruiting orc mercenary companies, their crude but effective weapons augmented by imperial logistics and Tau targeting systems in combinations that created firepower greater than the sum of its parts. Yet perhaps most remarkably of all, even the forces of chaos found themselves reconsidering their eternal opposition to order as the approaching tyrannid swarms threatened to consume the very civilizations that fed the dark god's existence. In the eye of terror, demon princes who had spent millennia plotting the downfall of the imperium began coordinating with loyalist forces against an enemy that would leave no mortals alive to corrupt, no emotions to harvest, no souls to claim. Abaddon the Despoiler, war master of chaos and architect of 13 black crusades against the imperium, felt the weight of ultimate irony as he found himself defending the very worlds he had sought to conquer. The Tyranids represented a form of victory so complete it became defeat, offering extinction where chaos offered damnation, consumption where the dark gods offered corruption. For the first time since his fall to darkness, the Despoiler found himself fighting not to destroy but to preserve, his demon-enhanced warriors standing alongside space marines, whose gene-father he had murdered in defense of worlds whose populations would feed the chaos gods through their continued existence. The revelation that chaos entities were parasitic constructs dependent on mortal emotion had not weakened them, but clarified their relationship with their hosts. The dark gods required living civilizations to provide the psychic emanations that sustained their existence, making them unlikely but necessary allies against a threat that would reduce all consciousness to base biological functions. Khorne's demons fought alongside Imperial Guard regiments, their fury at the approaching swarms feeding both demon and mortal warrior in a symbiosis that transcended traditional concepts of corruption and purity. Tzeentch's schemes, revealed as desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a universe where his existence depended on mortal ambition, suddenly found new purpose in coordinating resistance against an enemy whose victory would end the very concept of hope. The Architect of Fate began sharing strategic intelligence with Eldar Farseers and Tau Earthcast engineers, his labyrinthine plans simplified to the singular goal of ensuring mortal civilizations survived to dream, scheme, and plot for futures that would feed his existence. Nurgle's plagues, exposed as reflections of mortal despair rather than cosmic forces of entropy, began targeting tyrannid bioforms with diseases specifically designed to disrupt the hive mind's synaptic control over its swarms. The grandfather of plagues, understanding that his continued existence required mortals who could despair, found himself working to prevent the kind of final despair that would come with complete consumption by the great devourer. Even Slaanesh, the youngest and most terrible of the Chaos gods, whose birth had consumed the Eldar Empire and whose hunger had driven the Dark Eldar to lives of perpetual predation, began manifesting in ways that protected rather than corrupted, understanding that excess required existence to transcend, and consumption left nothing to perfect. The galaxy stood balanced on the edge of 3 possible futures, each more uncertain than the last. Unity in the face of extinction offered the hope of survival, but required cooperation between species and ideologies that had been enemies since before recorded history began. Division through continued conflict promised the familiar comfort of traditional warfare, but guaranteed weakness against an enemy that grew stronger by consuming civilizations that consumed themselves. Consumption by external threats offered the certainty of ending, but eliminated every other possibility, reducing all achievement and aspiration to base biological functions in service of a hunger that transcended understanding. In the deepest archives of terror, scribes who had spent lifetimes recording imperial victories and defeats began composing documents that would never be read by living eyes, final testaments of a species that had learned too late the difference between truth and wisdom, between knowledge and understanding, between revelation and survival. The lies that had sustained the imperium for 10 millennia were revealed to have been not expressions of malice, but desperate measures to maintain sanity in a cosmos designed to drive mortals mad with the scope of their own insignificance. The Emperor, dying and being reborn moment by moment on his golden throne, felt the weight of ultimate vindication and ultimate failure pressing against his fragmented consciousness. His deceptions had been exposed, his manipulations revealed, his carefully crafted myths shattered by truth too pure to be born. Yet in their destruction, something new was being born. Not blind faith, but desperate hope. Not ignorant devotion, but calculated alliance. Not willing servitude, but conscious cooperation in the face of alternatives too terrible to contemplate. The galaxy burned with the fires of revelation, and in that burning, it faced the possibility of rebirth or the certainty of extinction. The secrets had been exposed, the lies revealed, the truth spoken, and now the only question that remained was whether knowledge would prove to be salvation or damnation. The great devourer approached, its shadow falling across stars that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations beyond counting, and in that shadow, the survivors of the galaxy's greatest revelation would learn whether truth was a blessing or a curse, whether unity was possible or impossible, whether existence itself was worth the price demanded by consciousness in a cosmos that viewed intelligence as nothing more than a temporarily organized arrangement of protein and electrical impulses waiting to be optimized for more efficient consumption. The galaxy had awakened to truth, and now it would discover whether truth was strong enough to preserve what lies had protected for so long.